There is a place where the ocean meets the sky in an unbroken circle, where the horizon curves endlessly, and the world feels as if it floats suspended between water and stars, far out in the vastness of the Pacific, farther than almost any other inhabited land on Earth. There exists a small triangle of volcanic rock, a place that rose from the seafloor millennia ago, born of fire and pressure, shaped by wind and wave, and eventually discovered by people who crossed impossible distances to call it home. This island, this remote speck of Earth, measures only 64 square miles, and yet within that modest space, something extraordinary unfolded across centuries, something that would puzzle the world, inspire wonder, and spark questions that echo across time. The island sits more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continental shore, surrounded by nothing but rolling blue emptiness, and the nearest neighboring islands lie over 1,000 miles away, making this one of the most isolated places human beings have ever chosen to settle. When the first voyagers arrived, they brought with them everything required to sustain life in an unknown place: seeds and knowledge, stories and skills, the accumulated wisdom of generations of ocean travelers, people who read the stars and currents with an intimacy we can barely imagine now. They called the island Rapa Nui, though the world would come to know it by another name, one given by a Dutch explorer who arrived on Easter Sunday in the year 1722, and so it became Easter Island in the maps and journals of distant nations. But long before any European ship appeared on that distant horizon, the island was already home to a thriving culture, a society that would create something unprecedented, something that would endure long after the culture itself had transformed beyond recognition. The Moai, those silent stone figures, those monumental faces that gaze inland across the grasslands, they stand as testament to human ingenuity, to vision, to the capacity for creation even in isolation, or perhaps especially in isolation, where there is nothing to rely upon but the resources at hand and the strength of shared purpose. Nearly 900 of these figures were carved, some still resting in the quarry where they were born from volcanic rock, others transported across the island to stand upon ceremonial platforms, and a few, the largest and most ambitious, left unfinished, abandoned mid-creation, their backs still connected to the mountain that gave them form. The story of how they came to be and why, and what they meant to the people who carved them, is a story woven from archaeology and oral tradition, from scientific analysis and cultural memory, from the physical evidence left in the landscape and the knowledge passed down through generations. It is a story of arrival and adaptation, of innovation and ambition, of success and struggle, and ultimately of transformation, because nothing on Rapa Nui stayed the same, just as nothing anywhere ever truly does. The island's history unfolds like layers of volcanic stone, each era building upon the last, each generation leaving its mark, and the wind and rain, an endless passage of time revealing what was hidden, eroding what once seemed permanent, and preserving fragments that allow us to glimpse backward into a world that vanished centuries ago. To understand this place, it helps to begin not with the Moai themselves, but with the ocean that surrounds them, and the people who cross that ocean, guided by stars and swells and the flight patterns of seabirds, navigating vast distance with precision born of deep knowledge and careful observation. These were the Polynesians, master voyagers, a people who had already settled islands scattered across millions of square miles of Pacific water, from Hawaii to New Zealand, from Samoa to the Marquesas, each journey a leap of faith, each landfall a triumph of human courage and skill, and sometime around the year 1200, though the exact date remains uncertain, a double-hulled voyaging canoe, or perhaps several, arrived at Rapa Nui, carrying the founders of a new society, the ancestors of a culture that would flourish in profound isolation for hundreds of years. What they found was an island covered in palm trees, a species that grew nowhere else on earth, with trunks thick enough to be hollowed into canoes and forests dense enough to provide timber for shelter, for tools, for the engineering projects that would soon reshape the landscape. The soil was fertile, enriched by volcanic minerals, and the climate temperate, neither too hot nor too cold, with regular rainfall and conditions suitable for the crops the settlers brought with them, sweet potatoes and taro, chickens and rats, both intentional and accidental passengers on that founding voyage. The island offered no rivers, no lakes, but water could be found in springs and collected in hollows, and the surrounding ocean provided fish and shellfish, and the seasonal arrival of seabirds brought additional protein and a source of eggs. It was enough, more than enough, to support a growing population, and in the early centuries of settlement, the community expanded, developed traditions, refined techniques, and began the work that would define them. The carving began slowly at first, smaller statues, experiments in form and meaning, but over time the Moai grew larger, more numerous, more central to the culture's identity and spiritual practice. Each statue represented an ancestor, a revered figure whose mana, whose spiritual power would watch over the living, protect the community, and connect the present to the sacred past. They were carved at Ranoraraku, a volcanic crater whose compressed ash was perfect for sculpting, soft enough to work with stone tools, yet durable enough to endure the elements once complete. The quarry itself became a sacred workshop, a place where stone shapers spent years learning their craft, studying the grain of the rock, understanding how it fractured and held, how to read the subtle variations that meant the difference between a successful carving and a flawed one that might crack partway through the work. Generation after generation, the knowledge accumulated. Techniques refined themselves through practice and observation, and the Moai evolved from simple forms into the distinctive shapes that would eventually captivate the world. The earliest statues were more rounded, less refined in their features, experimental in their proportions, as if the carvers were still discovering what these figures should become, what qualities they should embody, what presence they should project. But by the 14th century, a clear aesthetic had emerged. The Moai possessed elongated heads, prominent brows, broad noses, thin lips pressed into expressions of calm authority, and bodies that were stylized rather than realistic, with long torsos and arms that rested against the abdomen, hands positioned as if in ceremonial gesture. The backs of the statues bore intricate designs, petroglyphs that represented tattoos or perhaps spiritual symbols, decorations that would never be seen once the Moai stood in place, yet were carved with the same care as the visible surfaces, suggesting that every aspect held meaning, that nothing was merely ornamental, Each statue took months or even years to complete, depending on its size, and the work required teams of specialists, not just the master carvers who shaped the features, but others who smoothed the surfaces, who carved the designs, who managed the complex logistics of feeding and housing the workers, because this was not casual labor, not something done in spare moments. This was intensive, focused, requiring sustained effort and coordination and the resources to support dozens of people working full-time on a single project. The island's population had grown steadily since settlement, reaching perhaps 7,000 people by the 15th century. Some estimates suggest even more, and this population was organized into clans, each with its own territory, its own platforms, where ancestors would eventually stand watch. These platforms, called ahu, were themselves remarkable constructions, massive stone foundations built with precisely fitted blocks, some weighing many tons, arranged in long rectangular structures that faced inland toward the clan's lands and settlements, with their backs to the sea. The ahu served as ceremonial centers, places where the living honored the dead, where rituals marked the passage of seasons and celebrated important events, where the community gathered to reinforce bonds and acknowledge the ancestors whose mana protected them. And onto these platforms, the Moai would eventually be transported, raised upright, and crowned with pukau, cylindrical top knots carved from red scoria, a different volcanic stone quarried from a separate location, adding another layer of complexity to the construction process. But before any statue could stand upon an ahu, it had to make a journey, had to be moved from the quarry at Rano-Raraku across miles of uneven terrain, across hills and valleys, over ground that could be soft or rocky, steep or relatively flat. The average Moai weighed between 12 and 15 tons, though some exceeded 80 tons, and the largest ever carved, a figure that remained unfinished in the quarry, would have weighed close to 200 tons if completed, a scale that defies easy comprehension even now. How these massive figures were transported remains one of archaeology's most debated questions, and various theories have been proposed and tested over the decades, each with evidence to support it, each revealing something about the ingenuity required. Some researchers suggest the statues were laid horizontally on wooden sledges, pulled across the landscape using ropes made from fibrous plants, with teams of people hauling in coordinated rhythm, perhaps guided by chants or songs that kept everyone moving together, preventing the dangerous chaos that could occur if the pulling became uneven. This method would have required extensive use of timber, both for the sledges themselves and for rollers placed beneath them, logs that would need to be continually repositioned as the statue inched forward, a labor-intensive process, but one that many ancient cultures employed successfully. Others proposed that the Moai were transported upright, walked across the island by rocking them side to side, using ropes attached to the head and base, teams pulling in alternating directions to create a controlled wobbling motion that moved the statue forward in small increments. This technique has been demonstrated experimentally with replica Moai, and it has the advantage of requiring less timber, and oral traditions from Rapa Nui speak of the statues walking, which might preserve a memory of this method, or might be metaphorical, describing the Moai's spiritual power rather than the mechanics of their movement. Perhaps different clans used different techniques, or methods evolved over time as the statues grew larger and more challenging to move, or the approach varied depending on the terrain to be crossed, because innovation rarely follows a single path, especially when the challenges are unprecedented. What seems certain is that the transportation required careful planning, extensive preparation, and the cooperation of many people working in concert, because even a small mistake could result in disaster. A statue falling and shattering, months or years of work destroyed in an instant. The roads themselves can still be traced across the landscape, worn paths radiating from Rano Raraku toward various parts of the island, and along these routes, archaeologists have found abandoned moai, statues that never reached their destinations, left lying where they fell or were set down. Silent witnesses to journeys interrupted for reasons now lost to time. Some were likely abandoned because they broke during transport, developing cracks that made them unsuitable for display, while others might have been set aside temporarily and never retrieved, perhaps because the clan's priorities shifted or resources became scarce, or the project was overtaken by other concerns. By the 15th century, the carving and transportation of moai had become central to Rapa Nui's culture, a practice that demonstrated a clan's strength and devotion, that honored ancestors and affirmed identity, and that required the sustained effort of much of the community. But this intensive activity depended on the island's resources, and those resources were not unlimited. The palm forests that had covered Rapa Nui at the time of settlement were gradually being depleted. Trees cut for construction, for moving statues, for firewood and agriculture, and the palms reproduced slowly, taking decades to reach maturity, meaning the rate of consumption outpaced the rate of regrowth. Pollen cores taken from the island's crater lakes reveal this transformation, showing a landscape that was once heavily forested, becoming progressively more open, the percentages of palm pollen declining century by century, replaced by grasses and shrubs, plants that could colonize cleared ground more quickly. The rats that had arrived with the first settlers also played a role, multiplying rapidly in an environment with few predators and feeding on palm nuts before they could germinate, further limiting the forest's ability to regenerate, creating a pressure that compounded the effects of a human harvesting. As the trees became scarcer, their value increased, and competition for resources may have intensified among the clans, each wanting to complete their own moai projects, each needing timber for their own purposes, and perhaps becoming more protective of what remained in their territories. The archaeological record from this period shows a society at its height of cultural achievement, creating increasingly ambitious moai, developing sophisticated agricultural systems with rock gardens and stone mulching to protect crops from wind and preserve soil moisture, and sustaining a population that had grown larger than the island would ever support again. But the seeds of transformation were already present in the thinning forests, in the intensifying competition, in the growing complexity of managing limited resources across multiple clans, each pursuing their own goals, each bound by tradition to honor their ancestors through ever more impressive monuments. The moai themselves grew larger through the generations, as if size became a measure of devotion or prestige or spiritual power, and the technical challenges of carving and moving these giants pushed the limits of what the island's resources and population could sustain. At Rano, Raraku, dozens of statues in various stages of completion crowd the crater slopes, some nearly finished, awaiting only the final detachment from the bedrock, others barely begun, their outlines sketched, but their features not yet defined, and the largest of all, a figure that would have stood over 70 feet tall, abandoned when it became clear that completing it would be impossible, or impractical, or perhaps simply unnecessary. The quarry preserves a moment frozen in time, tools laid down and never picked up again, statues left in positions that suggest sudden cessation rather than gradual winding down, as if the work stopped not through slow decline, but through some shift that made continuing seem pointless or impossible, or perhaps redirected energy toward different concerns. But that transformation, that shift from the age of Moai building to something else entirely, belongs to a later chapter of the island's story. For now, in the early centuries, the culture was ascending, refining its traditions, developing the practices that would define it, and creating monuments that would outlast the society that carved them by centuries. The people lived in elliptical houses made of stone foundations with superstructures of wood and thatch, arranged in settlements near the coast where marine resources were most accessible, and they cultivated gardens inland, growing sweet potatoes in carefully tended plots, raising chickens that provided eggs and meat, and fishing the surrounding waters for tuna and other species. Life followed the rhythms of seasons and ceremonies, of planting and harvest, of birth and death, and the endless work of maintaining existence on an island where everything had to come from within, where there was no possibility of trade with distant lands, no way to import what was lacking or export what was surplus. Self-sufficiency became not just a practical necessity, but a defining characteristic, shaping every aspect of how the society organized itself, how it allocated labor, how it passed knowledge from one generation to the next. The master carvers held positions of great respect. Their skills were specialized and hard-won, requiring years of apprenticeship, learning to read the stone, to understand which areas would yield to the basalt tools, which sections might harbor hidden flaws that would only reveal themselves partway through the work. They worked with toki, hand axes made from basalt, a volcanic rock harder than the compressed tuff of the quarry walls, and these tools had to be constantly resharpened, the edges flaking and dulling with use, creating a steady demand for new basalt and the labor to shape it into functional implements. Around the quarry, the ground is still littered with these tools, thousands of them, abandoned where they were last used, offering a glimpse into the sheer scale of the operation, the amount of work represented by each finished moai, the countless hours of striking stone against stone, of dust and chips, of incremental progress measured in fractions of inches. The carving began with outlining the figure's shape on the rock face, tracing the form that would emerge, and then the painstaking work of removal, chipping away everything that was not the statue, creating the eye sockets first, deep hollows that would later give the moai its distinctive gaze, then the prominent brow ridge, the long straight nose, the thin compressed lips. The ears were carved with elaborate detail, elongated and stylized, sometimes reaching nearly to the shoulders, and in the lobes there were often carved designs, perhaps representing the ear ornaments that clan leaders would have worn, markers of status made permanent in stone. As the figure took shape, the carvers worked their way down the body, defining the arms, the hands, the patterns on the back, and finally detaching the statue from the bedrock, cutting beneath it to free it completely, leaving only a keel of stone connecting the Moai to the mountain, a final attachment that would be severed when the time came to move the figure, but before that moment arrived, the statue would sometimes remain in the quarry for years, decades even, waiting for the resources to become available for transport, waiting for the clan to organize the massive effort required, waiting in a forest of other waiting figures, all facing outward from the crater slopes, all gazing toward the island they would eventually cross. Some moai were erected temporarily at the quarry itself, placed in pits dug to hold them upright, perhaps for a final evaluation of their proportions, or as part of a blessing ceremony, or simply because they looked impressive standing, a preview of how they would appear once installed on their permanent platforms. The pits can still be seen, and some still hold statues, figures that appear to be buried to their shoulders, though in fact they stand on the original ground surface, and centuries of erosion have deposited soil around them, making them seem partially submerged, as if the earth were slowly reclaiming what had been pulled from it. When a moai was finally ready for its journey, the entire community would have been involved in some capacity, some pulling the ropes, others clearing the path, moving obstacles, filling in depressions that might cause the statue to tilt dangerously, and still others providing food and water for the workers, organizing shifts so the effort could continue through daylight hours without exhaustion, compromising safety. The oral traditions speak of specialists who knew the songs to sing during transport, rhythmic chants that coordinated the pulling that kept everyone moving together. And perhaps these songs also served a spiritual purpose, invoking the ancestors' mana, asking for protection during the dangerous journey, acknowledging the sacredness of the work. A successful transport might take weeks, covering only a few hundred feet per day, with frequent pauses to adjust the ropes, to rest the pullers, to verify that the statue remained undamaged, and the arrival at the ahu would have been a moment of celebration, the culmination of years of planning and effort, the moment when the ancestor could finally take up residence among the living. But installing the moai on the platform presented yet another challenge, because the statues had to be raised from horizontal to vertical, lifted onto the ahu, and positioned precisely so they faced inland, watching over the clan's territory with that distinctive forward-leaning posture, as if straining slightly to see into the distance. The most widely accepted method involves building a ramp of stones behind the ahu, gradually raising it as the statue is pulled upright, the moai's base sliding up the ramp as the top pivots, until the figure reaches vertical and can be eased back onto the platform, settling into place with a weight and permanence that suggested it had always belonged there. Once standing, the moai would receive its pukao, that cylindrical topknot of red scoria, quarried from Punapau, a crater on the opposite side of the island from Rano Raraku, adding yet another layer of complexity and coordination, because these top knots, some weighing several tons, had to be transported separately and then somehow lifted to crown the statue, raised to a height of 20 or even 30 feet. The red stone contrasted dramatically with the pale gray of the Moai itself, and some researchers believe the pukau represented a traditional Polynesian hairstyle, while others suggest they might symbolize the red feather headdresses worn by chiefs. But whatever their specific meaning, they added a finishing touch, a completion of the figure's transformation from raw stone to honored ancestor. And finally, the eyes would be installed, white coral for the sclera, black obsidian or red scoria for the pupil, giving the Moai the ability to see, to watch, to fulfill their protective role. And this moment, the opening of the eyes, may have been the most sacred part of the entire process. The instant when the statue truly came alive with spiritual power. Most of the coral eyes were lost or removed long ago, but a few have been found in excavations around fallen Moai, and their discovery allowed researchers to understand that the statues were never meant to have empty eye sockets, but rather were intended to gaze, to witness, to maintain constant vigilance over the living. At the height of Moai construction, during the 16th and early 17th centuries, nearly all the major ahu around the island held their watching figures. Some platforms supported single massive statues. Others bore multiple Moai standing shoulder to shoulder, creating a line of ancestors, a wall of protective presence. The largest platforms held as many as 15 Moai, and these great ahu were located at significant points around the coast, marking territorial boundaries, or perhaps places of special spiritual importance, locations where the veil between the physical and sacred worlds seemed thinner, where communication with the ancestors felt more immediate. Ahu Tongariki, the largest platform ever constructed on Rapa Nui, eventually held 15 Moai, and the effort required to build this massive structure, to quarry and transport the foundation stones, to level the ground and create a stable base, must have required years of sustained work by dozens of people, a commitment of resources that speaks to the platform's importance within the island's ceremonial landscape. The society had developed a sophisticated understanding of engineering, of leverage and counterweight, of how to move massive objects with limited tools and technology. And this knowledge was purely empirical, gained through trial and error, through careful observation of what worked and what failed, through the accumulated experience of generations. There were no written records to preserve this knowledge, no diagrams or instruction manuals. Everything was passed down orally, demonstrated physically, learned through apprenticeship and practice, and this meant that losing a master craftsman meant losing some portion of the collective expertise, creating pressure to train successors before that knowledge could vanish. The culture developed a rich tradition of oral literature, creation, myths and genealogies, songs and stories that explained the world and preserved history, and among these was the legend of how the first people arrived, led by Hotu Matua, the founding chief, who came from a land called Hiva, and brought with him the knowledge and resources needed to establish civilization on this remote island, whether Hiva was a real place, perhaps the Marquesas Islands or another Polynesian homeland, or whether it existed more as a mythic origin point, remains uncertain, but the stories maintained the connection to a wider Polynesian world, to ancestors who had crossed vast oceans, who possessed deep knowledge of navigation and seamanship. And there were stories about the Moai too, about how they walked from the quarry, about competitions between clans to create the most impressive statues, about the spiritual power they embodied, and about what would happen if that power was not properly respected or maintained. The Rapa Nui understanding of mana, spiritual power or prestige, was central to their worldview, and the Moai served as vessels and amplifiers of this mana, connecting the living to the ancestors, ensuring prosperity and protection as long as the proper relationships and rituals were maintained. But maintaining these relationships required resources, required the ability to continue carving, to continue moving statues, to continue building and maintaining the ahu, and as the forests diminished, as timber became increasingly scarce, the physical basis for these practices began to erode. The last large trees were likely gone by the early 1600s, and without them, constructing new Moai transportation systems became difficult or impossible. Moving the largest statues was no longer feasible, and even maintaining existing structures grew more challenging as wood for repairs became unavailable. The archaeological record shows that Moai production continued even as the forests vanished, perhaps because the cultural imperative remained strong, because abandoning the practice would have meant abandoning the ancestors, abandoning the core of what made the society meaningful. And so the work continued, but the statues grew smaller, more manageable, sized to match the reduced capacity of a timber-poor island. The crater at Rano Raraku tells this story in stone. The finished Moai, waiting at the quarry, their journeys never begun, represent not the sudden collapse of a civilization, but rather the gradual transformation of priorities, the slow recognition that the old ways no longer aligned with new realities. Some researchers estimate that nearly 400 Moai remained at the quarry in various stages of completion when the carving finally ceased, some fully formed and ready for transport, others barely begun, and these unfinished figures offer insight into the carving process itself, showing the sequence of work, the areas tackled first and those left for later, the techniques employed at different stages, but they also represent dreams unfulfilled, ancestors who would never take their places on the ahu, projects abandoned as the society's energy and resources redirected toward more immediate concerns, towards survival in an environment that had become considerably more challenging than the island the first settlers had encountered. Without timber for large-scale construction, without the forests that had provided so much, the people adapted. They always adapted, because human beings are remarkably resilient when faced with changing circumstances, finding new ways to meet old needs, developing alternative strategies when familiar approaches no longer work. Agriculture intensified. The rock gardens became more elaborate, more extensive, as people worked to maximize crop yields from limited arable land, building stone walls to protect plants from salt spray and wind, mulching with stones to preserve soil moisture, creating thousands of small enclosed gardens that turned marginal land into productive space. Chickens became increasingly important as a protein source. Housed in elaborate stone structures called hair moa, chicken houses with narrow entrances designed to prevent theft, because as resources tightened, competition for food grew more intense, and protecting what one had became as important as producing more. The remains of these chicken houses still dot the landscape, testament to the ingenuity applied to animal husbandry, to the care taken to protect valuable resources, and to the social tensions that made such protection necessary. Warfare, or at least violent conflict, appears in the archaeological record during this period, not as the cause of the society's transformation, but as one of its symptoms, one response to the pressures of resource scarcity and competition. And the evidence comes from several sources: fortified cave sites, places where families or clans could retreat and defend themselves, became more common, and human remains show increased instances of violent trauma. Skull fractures and bone damage consistent with combat, suggesting that disputes sometimes escalated beyond verbal resolution. The oral traditions preserve stories of warrior classes, of battles between clans, of competitions and conflicts that pitted group against group. And while some of these tales may be embellished or mythologized, they likely preserve kernels of historical truth, memories of a time when social cohesion frayed under pressure. And at some point, perhaps gradually rather than suddenly, the Moai themselves became targets, not of destruction exactly, but of toppling, of being pulled forward off their platforms to fall face down on the ground, breaking the fall with carefully placed stones to prevent complete shattering, as if even in overthrowing the statues, there remained some reluctance to destroy them utterly. Nearly all the Moai that once stood on Ahu now lie fallen, pushed from their platforms, and the distribution of this toppling around the island suggests it was systematic rather than random, deliberate rather than accidental, as if each clan eventually decided that the old ancestors no longer served their purposes, or perhaps that new spiritual understandings superseded the old. Some researchers suggest the toppling represented a revolution, a rejection of the old order by a population that blamed the ancestor-focused religion for the island's problems, a turning away from Moai worship toward new beliefs and practices. Others propose that the toppling occurred during interclan conflicts, with victorious groups overthrowing their enemies' Moai to demonstrate superiority, to break the spiritual protection those ancestors provided, to assert dominance over conquered territory. Or perhaps the falling Moai simply reflected the recognition that maintaining them no longer made sense, that the resources required for upkeep could be better used elsewhere, that the society needed to move forward rather than continually looking back to ancestral glory, whatever the specific causes. And likely there were multiple factors operating simultaneously. The age of Moai construction ended, and a new cultural pattern emerged, centered not on the massive stone figures, but on a very different kind of competition and spiritual practice. This new tradition focused on Orongo, a ceremonial village perched on the rim of Ranokau, another volcanic crater at the southwestern tip of the island, where stone houses with corbelled roofs clustered near the cliff edge, looking out over the ocean toward three small rocky islets that lay offshore. Each spring, representatives from different clans would gather at Orongo for the Birdman competition, a ritual that combined physical endurance, spiritual significance, and social prestige into a single dramatic event. The participants would descend the sheer cliff face, swim through shark-infested waters to the largest islet, and search for the first egg of the sooty tern, a seabird that nested there seasonally, and whoever found the first egg and successfully brought it back to Orongo, swimming the dangerous channel and climbing the cliff with the egg intact, would earn the title of Birdman for the coming year. The winner, or more precisely, the clan leader who sponsored the successful competitor, would hold special status, would enjoy certain privileges and rights, and would serve as a focal point for the island's spiritual life until the next year's competition. This tradition represented a fundamental shift from the Moai era, from an emphasis on permanent stone monuments and ancestral reverence to a focus on annual renewal, on competition and achievement, on proving worth through action rather than inheritance. The houses at Orongo are covered with petroglyphs, carved images of birdmen, part human and part frigate bird, along with symbols representing the god Make, the creator deity, who became increasingly central to Rapa Nui spirituality during this later period. These carvings show a different aesthetic than the Moai, more fluid, more varied in style, as if the artistic impulse that once channeled into statue-making found new outlets, new forms of expression that matched the changed circumstances. And the Birdman cult persisted, becoming the dominant ceremonial tradition, lasting until the 19th century when European contact, disease, and slave raids devastated the population and disrupted traditional practices beyond recovery. But before those catastrophic external interventions, before the arrival of ships brought smallpox and tuberculosis, before Peruvian slavers kidnapped over 1,000 people, before the island's population plummeted to barely more than 100 survivors, the Rapa Nui people had already navigated centuries of transformation, had already adapted to environmental changes that would have destroyed less resilient societies. They developed new agricultural techniques, new social structures, new religious practices, and they survived, diminished perhaps from their peak numbers, living more modestly than their ancestors who built the great Ahu, but surviving nonetheless, maintaining their identity, preserving their stories, passing knowledge to new generations. The first European contact came in 1722 when Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday, hence the name that stuck on European maps, and he found an island with a smaller population than it once supported, but still inhabited, still functioning, still possessing a distinct culture and way of life. Roggeveen observed standing Moai, noted the island's treeless landscape, commented on the ingenuity of the agricultural systems, and departed after a brief stay, followed decades later by other European visitors, Spanish and British expeditions that mapped the island, documented what they saw, and introduced diseases to which the Rapa Nui had no immunity. Each successive contact brought more disruption, more disease, more interference in traditional practices, and by the mid-19th century, the population had crashed catastrophically. The old social structures had collapsed, and much of the traditional knowledge had been lost with the elders who carried it. The Moai had already fallen by this point, toppled during the previous centuries of transformation and conflict, and they lay on the ground, silent witnesses to a history that the surviving population could no longer fully explain, because so much knowledge had vanished, so many stories had died with their tellers. What remained were fragments, pieces of a larger puzzle, and for over a century, outsiders would try to reconstruct what had happened on this remote island, developing theories that often said more about the theorists' own preconceptions than about Rapa Nui's actual history. Some saw the fallen Moai as evidence of ecological catastrophe, proof that civilizations inevitably destroy themselves through environmental mismanagement, a cautionary tale about the consequences of exceeding carrying capacity. Others interpreted the island's history through frameworks of warfare and collapse, emphasizing violence and destruction, imagining dramatic battles and sudden downfalls, narratives of hubris and punishment that fit certain storytelling conventions but oversimplified the complex reality. And many early accounts simply could not imagine how a supposedly primitive people could have created such impressive monuments, leading to fringe theories about lost civilizations or even extraterrestrial intervention, ideas that denied the Rapa Nui their own achievements, their own ingenuity and determination. But gradually, through careful archaeological work, through analysis of pollen cores and excavated sites, through collaboration with Rapa Nui descendants who preserved oral traditions, and through experimental archaeology that tested various hypotheses about statue construction and transport, a more nuanced understanding emerged, a picture of a society that thrived in isolation, that developed unique cultural practices, that faced environmental challenges, partly of their own making and partly beyond their control, and that transformed rather than simply collapsed, adapting to new circumstances, finding new ways forward when old paths became blocked. The Moai themselves, those silent stone faces, began to be understood not as mysteries or anomalies, but as logical expressions of a culture deeply rooted in Polynesian traditions, similar in purpose, if not in form, to monuments created on other islands, part of a broader pattern of Pacific peoples honoring ancestors, marking territory, and demonstrating their society's strength and cohesion. And so the Moai stand today, or rather, they stand again, because beginning in the 1950s, efforts began to restore some of the fallen figures, to raise them back onto their platforms, to give visitors and descendants alike a glimpse of how the island once appeared when hundreds of watching ancestors gazed inland across the landscape. The most extensive restoration took place at Ahu Tongariki, where 15 Moai now stand in a magnificent row, their backs to the ocean, their faces toward the island's interior, and seeing them upright, experiencing their scale and presence, offers something that photographs and descriptions cannot fully convey. They possess a gravity, a weight of meaning that transcends their physical mass. And standing before them, it becomes easier to understand why a culture would devote such extraordinary effort to their creation, because they are not merely sculptures, not simply impressive stonework, but embodiments of something deeper, connections to ancestors, assertions of identity, prayers made permanent in volcanic stone. The restoration work itself required modern equipment, cranes and concrete, tools and techniques the original builders never possessed. And yet the challenges remained formidable, requiring careful planning, precise engineering, and deep respect for the cultural significance of what was being raised. Japanese researchers and engineers collaborated with Rapa Nui descendants on the Tongariki restoration, combining technical expertise with cultural knowledge, ensuring that the work honored both the physical monuments and the traditions they represented. And when the 15 Moai finally stood again in 1995, the island celebrated, because something lost had been recovered, not perfectly, not as it originally was, but recovered nonetheless. Other ahu around the island have also been restored, though most remain as they fell, lying face down in the grass, their backs exposed to the sky, and there is something powerful about seeing them both ways, upright and fallen, because both states tell part of the story, Both reveal something true about the island's history. The standing Moai show what was achieved, the ambition and skill, the devotion and determination, while the fallen Moai show that nothing lasts forever unchanged, that all human achievements exist within time, subject to transformation, to the forces of nature and culture, and the endless unfolding of events beyond any individual's control. Modern research continues to refine understanding of Rapa Nui's history. New excavations reveal previously unknown details. Chemical analysis of tools and statues provides insights into quarrying and carving techniques, and studies of rat bones and plant remains clarify the timeline of environmental change. Some recent work suggests the environmental transformation may have occurred more gradually than earlier theories proposed, that the forest did not disappear overnight, but thinned slowly over generations, allowing time for adaptation, for the development of alternative practices, for the society to adjust rather than simply collapse. Other research emphasizes the role of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that affected the Pacific, bringing changes in rainfall patterns and ocean temperatures, creating additional pressures beyond those generated by human activity, reminding us that history always unfolds within larger contexts, that isolated communities are never truly isolated from global systems and patterns. And increasingly, Rapa Nui descendants have become central to these research efforts, bringing traditional knowledge, cultural perspectives, and a deep personal connection to the island's history, ensuring that the story told is not just about the ancient Rapa Nui, but also honors the living community that continues to call the island home. Because Rapa Nui is not merely an archaeological site, not simply a museum of past achievements, but a living place, home to people who maintain cultural traditions, who speak the Rapa Nui language, who practice traditional arts, and who see themselves as part of an unbroken line stretching back to Hotu Matua and the original settlers. The island teaches many lessons for those willing to listen, about resilience and adaptation, about the relationship between culture and environment, about how societies respond to challenge and change, and about the human capacity for both creation and destruction, for building monuments that outlast their builders, and for transforming when circumstances demand it. It reminds us that isolation is both a blessing and a constraint, that self-sufficiency requires careful stewardship, that resources once depleted may not return, and that the choices made by one generation echo forward, shaping possibilities for those who come after. But it also demonstrates that endings are rarely absolute. That transformation is not the same as destruction, that cultures adapt and persist even through tremendous challenges, finding new forms, new practices, new ways of being that honor the past while acknowledging present realities. The Moai themselves endure as testament to all of this, carved from stone that will last millennia. They watched the forests disappear, witnessed the society transform, survived the toppling and the centuries lying in the grass, and now stand again, restored by descendants and allies, continuing their watch over an island that is both changed and changeless, both modern and ancient, both unique and universal in its lessons. Night falls slowly over Rapa Nui, the sun sinking into the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, and the Moai stand in silhouette against the fading light, their features softened by shadow, their presence somehow amplified by the gathering darkness. The wind moves through the grass, the same wind that has blown across this island for millions of years, that shaped the volcanic cones before humans arrived, that witnessed everything that has transpired here and will continue long after this moment passes into memory. Somewhere in the crater at Ranoraraku, unfinished Moai rest against the slope, their carving interrupted centuries ago, and the stone still bears the marks of the tools that shaped them, still shows where the work stopped, where hands set down their toki and walked away, for reasons known only to those who made that choice. The ocean surrounds everything, vast and deep, the same ocean the first voyagers crossed, the same waves that have broken against these shores since the island rose from the sea floor, and in the sound of the surf there is something eternal, something that puts human endeavor into perspective, reminds us of our smallness, our brevity, and yet also our significance, because we are the ones who notice, who wonder, who seek meaning in stone and story. The stars emerge, the same constellations that guided ancient navigators, and somewhere above this tiny island, the universe continues its expansion, galaxies wheeling through space, everything in motion, everything changing, and yet the patterns persist, the cycles continue, day and night, season and season, generation following generation, each adding its verse to a song that has no final stanza, no ultimate conclusion, only the ongoing improvisation of existence itself. The Moai remain, weathering slowly, their features gradually softening under the erosive force of wind and rain, but enduring nonetheless, standing watch as they have for centuries, as they will for centuries more, silent witnesses to whatever comes next, to the unfolding story of this island and its people, to the continuation of something that began when the first canoe touched shore, and that continues still in the living culture, in the restored monuments, in the ongoing conversation between past and present. And perhaps that is what the Moai ultimately represent. Not frozen moments or static achievements, but connections across time, bridges between what was and what is, reminders that we are all part of something larger than ourselves, that our actions ripple forward, that what we build, what we create, what we preserve or neglect, matters in ways we cannot fully predict or control. The wind quiets, the light fades further, and in the growing darkness, the island settles into itself, into the deep silence that exists beneath the sound of waves, beneath the rustle of grass, a silence that is not empty but full of presence, full of memory, full of the accumulated weight of all the moments that have passed here, all the lives lived, all the choices made, all the hands that lifted stone, all the eyes that watched the horizon, all the voices that sang the songs now lost, and all the dreams that took form in volcanic rock and endure still, waiting, watching, holding space for wonder, for questions, for the quiet contemplation of what it means to create, to endure, to transform, and ultimately to simply be here on this small island, beneath these stars, surrounded by ocean, part of a story that continues, that flows like water, like time itself, moving ever forward, ever onward, into the vast and gentle darkness, where all stories eventually rest, where the Moai stand eternal in their stone patience, and the wind whispers over grass, and the waves touch shore, and everything Everything slowly, softly fades into the quiet, into the peace, into the deep and dreamless stillness. I look up, and there it is, the night sky spread wide and endless above me, deeper than I ever remember it being, darker in some places, brighter in others, scattered with points of light that seem almost to breathe. For a moment, I simply stand here, letting my eyes adjust, watching as more stars emerge from what seemed like emptiness just seconds ago. Hundreds of them, thousands, and I know that each one is a sun burning across distances I can barely begin to comprehend. But tonight, I'm not thinking about those distant suns. Not really, because tonight my attention turns closer to home, to the family of worlds that circles our own star, the solar system, this small corner of space that belongs to us, that we've gazed upon since the first human eyes turned skyward. The word itself, solar, comes from the Latin for sun, and everything here, every planet, every moon, every grain of dust floating in the dark, all of it belongs to that central fire, our sun, the star we orbit, the light we wake to each morning. I imagined it now, the sun as it actually is, not the gentle disk we see filtered through our atmosphere, but the roiling sphere of plasma, hydrogen fusing into helium in its core, temperatures reaching 15 million degrees, a furnace so vast that 1 million Earths could fit inside it. And yet, from here, from this distance of 93 million miles, it appears as nothing more than a warm circle in the sky. Around it, the planets sweep their ancient paths, following the same orbits they have traced for billions of years, moving through the silence of space with a grace that seems almost choreographed, almost deliberate. I think about how we've always known they were there, those wandering lights. The Greeks called them planetae, wanderers, because they moved against the fixed stars, drifting through the constellations, marking time with their patient journeys, and for thousands of years, that's all we knew, that they moved, that they were different from the stars. But we couldn't see them, not really, not the way we can now with our telescopes and our spacecraft, our probes that have ventured to the edge of the solar system and beyond. Now we know them intimately. We've mapped their surfaces, tasted their atmospheres, walked on their moons, sent our machines to drill into their soil and measure their magnetic fields. We know that Mercury, closest to the sun, turns so slowly that a single day there lasts longer than 2 of its years. Its surface scarred and cratered, baked to 800 degrees on one side, frozen to nearly 300 below zero on the other. We know that Venus, shrouded in clouds of sulfuric acid, hides a surface hot enough to melt lead, its atmosphere pressing down with the weight of being half a mile underwater on Earth. And then there's our world, Earth, the blue marble, the pale blue dot, the only place in all the universe where we know for certain that life exists, with its oceans and its continents, its storms and its seasons, spinning through space at 67,000 miles per hour. And yet we feel none of it, sitting here looking up beyond us. Mars, the red planet, rust-colored from the iron oxide in its soil, with its massive volcanoes and its canyon system that would stretch across the entire United States, and its 2 small moons, Phobos and Deimos, fear and dread. named by someone with a sense of mythology and perhaps a touch of darkness. And then, farther out, past the asteroid belt, where countless rocks tumble in their orbits, the giants wait: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, worlds so massive they could swallow all the rocky planets combined and still have room, worlds with dozens of moons, with ring systems made of ice and rock, with storms that have raged for centuries, with winds that make our hurricanes look like gentle breezes. I let myself drift through this mental map, this scale model I'm building in my mind, trying to hold it all at once, the distances, the sizes, the strange and wonderful variety of it all, 8 major planets, 5 recognized dwarf planets, hundreds of moons, millions of asteroids, billions of comets waiting in the outer dark, all of it, every piece, held together by gravity, by the invisible hand of the sun's mass, pulling everything into its dance, keeping the whole system spinning like a vast cosmic mobile, balanced, precise, beautiful in its mathematics. And I realize, standing here, that this is home, not just Earth, but all of it, the entire solar system, this bubble of sun-warmed space 4.5 billion years old, born from a cloud of gas and dust that collapsed under its own weight, swirled into a disk, condensed into worlds. The same atoms that make up my body were forged in stars that died before our sun was born, scattered into space by supernovae, gathered again, reformed, reshaped, until eventually, impossibly, they became conscious enough to look back at the stars and wonder, tonight, I'm simply here, beneath this sky, thinking about the neighborhood of worlds around us, the solar system in all its quiet vastness, ready to wander through it, world by world, moon by moon, taking my time, letting the details wash over me like waves. The story begins in darkness, in a cloud of gas and dust drifting through space, so vast it would take light years to cross, so diffuse that if you stood inside it, you might not even know it was there. This was a solar nebula, our birthplace, floating in one arm of the Milky Way galaxy. 4.5 billion years ago, give or take a few million years, a span of time so immense that human history fits into it like a single grain of sand on an endless beach. Something happened, some disturbance, perhaps a nearby star exploded, a supernova, sending shock waves rippling through space. Or maybe it was the gravity of a passing stellar cluster. Whatever it was, it compressed the cloud, squeezed it, and when you compress gas, it heats up. And when it heats up enough, things begin to change. The cloud began to collapse, slowly at first, then faster, pulled inward by its own gravity. And as it collapsed, it started to spin, the way a figure skater spins faster when they pull their arms in. Conservation of angular momentum, the universe following its rules, indifferent and precise. As it spun, the cloud flattened like pizza dough thrown into the air, forming a disk, and at the center of that disk, where most of the mass was concentrating, the pressure built, the temperature climbed. Hydrogen atoms pressed closer and closer together, and then ignition, the moment when the core became dense enough and hot enough for fusion to begin. Hydrogen atoms slamming together with such force that they fused into helium, releasing energy, enormous amounts of energy, and the sun was born. Our sun, a star like billions of others, nothing special on a cosmic scale, but to us, everything. The newborn sun wasn't alone. It had used only about 99.8% of the cloud's mass. The rest remained, scattered through the disk that surrounded it, the protoplanetary disk, the material from which worlds would form. In that disk, particles began to stick together, dust grains, ice crystals, tiny fragments of rock. They collided. Sometimes they bounced apart. Sometimes they stuck. Static electricity, molecular forces, building larger and larger clumps, pebbles, then rocks, then boulders, close to the sun, where the heat was intense. Only materials with high melting points could remain solid. Metals like iron and nickel, rocky silicates, the lighter elements, hydrogen, helium, water. These were blown outward by the solar wind, the stream of particles flowing from the young sun's surface, farther out, beyond what we now call the frost line, about 3 times Earth's distance from the sun. It was cold enough for ice to form, water ice, ammonia ice, methane ice. And because there was so much more of these materials than rock and metal, the clumps that formed there grew larger, much larger. These growing clumps, these planetesimals, ranged in size from kilometers to hundreds of kilometers across, and they continued to collide, to merge, the larger ones with stronger gravity pulling in the smaller ones, sweeping up material in their orbital paths. Near the sun, 4 rocky worlds were taking shape: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, the terrestrial planets, worlds of metal cores and rocky mantles, too small and too hot to hold on to the light gases that made up most of the original nebula. The process was violent, extraordinarily violent. These weren't gentle accumulations, but catastrophic impacts. Bodies the size of moons slamming into each other at thousands of miles per hour, melting, vaporizing, merging, reforming. Earth itself, our world, suffered one of these collisions about 4.5 billion years ago, not long after it first formed, a Mars-sized body, which we've named Theia, after the Greek Titan who was mother to the moon goddess Selene, struck Earth at an oblique angle. The impact was unimaginable. It would have liquefied both bodies, sent enormous amounts of material spraying into orbit, and from that debris ring, over time, our moon coalesced, gathering itself from the scattered remnants of both worlds, which is why lunar rocks brought back by the Apollo missions have such similar composition to Earth's mantle. This collision did more than give us our moon. It tilted Earth's axis, giving us our seasons, and it may have added to Earth's spin, our 24-hour day, though the moon was much closer then, appearing enormous in the sky, and Earth rotated faster, a day lasting perhaps only 5 or 6 hours. Beyond the rocky planets, in the colder reaches of the disk, the gas giants were forming: Jupiter, Saturn, and they were forming fast. They needed to, because the sun's early phase, the T Tauri phase, would soon blow away all the remaining gas in the disk. Jupiter's core formed first, growing massive enough, somewhere between 10 and 20 Earth masses, that its gravity could capture hydrogen and helium directly from the nebula, and once that process started, it accelerated, the planet ballooning to its current size, 318 times Earth's mass, in perhaps as little as a few million years. Saturn followed a similar path, though it ended up somewhat smaller, perhaps because it formed later or farther out, where the disk was less dense, or because Jupiter's gravity disrupted the flow of material, or all of these reasons, the early solar system was chaos, and teasing out exact causes from effects billions of years later requires detective work written in stone and ice. These giant planets didn't stay where they formed. Computer models suggest they migrated, moving inward or outward through the disk, their gravity stirring everything, scattering planetesimals, clearing gaps in the disk, redirecting comets and asteroids. There's a theory called the Grand Tack that suggests Jupiter migrated inward first, perhaps getting as close as 1.5 times Earth's distance from the Sun before Saturn caught up with it. And the two planets are locked in a gravitational resonance, migrated back outward together, like partners in a cosmic dance. If this happened, and the evidence is suggestive, though not conclusive, it would explain many things. Why Mars is so small. Perhaps Jupiter swept through the region where Mars was forming, scattering most of the material, leaving only scraps to form the red planet. Why the asteroid belt exists as a belt and not a planet. The competing gravitational influences preventing the rocks from ever settling into a single world. Farther out still, Uranus and Neptune were forming, smaller than Jupiter and Saturn, but still massive compared to Earth. And something strange happened to them too. Models suggest they didn't form where they are now. They formed closer in perhaps between where Saturn and Uranus orbit today, and something probably gravitational interactions with Jupiter and Saturn flung them outward. Neptune may have actually formed closer to the Sun than Uranus, and then been scattered outward, leapfrogging past its companion, settling into the outermost orbit of the major planets, 30 times farther from the Sun than Earth, where a single year takes 165 Earth years to complete. This outward migration of Neptune had enormous consequences. Beyond Neptune's orbit lay the Kuiper Belt, a region filled with icy bodies left over from the solar system's formation, and as Neptune moved through or near this region, its gravity scattered these objects, sending them flying in all directions. Some were ejected from the solar system entirely. Some fell inward, becoming the short-period comets we see today, and some were thrown into the Oort cloud, a vast spherical shell of icy bodies that surrounds the entire solar system, extending perhaps halfway to the nearest star. This period of chaos and migration, about 600 million to 700 million years after the solar system formed, is called the Late Heavy Bombardment, though recent research questions whether it was truly a distinct event or just the tail end of the initial formation period. Either way, the inner solar system was pummeled. The moon's surface still bears the scars, the dark Maria, the seas that aren't seas, but vast impact basins filled with solidified lava, created when massive objects struck with enough force to crack the lunar crust and release molten rock from below. Earth was hit too, certainly, but our active geology has erased most of the evidence. Plate tectonics, weathering, erosion, biological processes, all of them constantly reshaping the surface, burying the past, though a few ancient impact structures remain, ghostly impressions in the oldest rocks. Through all of this violence, all of this chaos, the solar system was sorting itself. The heavy bombardment gradually declined as the planets swept their orbits clear, as the remaining planetesimals were either absorbed, ejected, or locked into stable resonances, safe harbors in the gravitational landscape. By about 4 billion years ago, The architecture was essentially set. 4 rocky worlds close to the sun, 4 giants farther out, countless smaller bodies scattered throughout, and a new phase began. The long, slow cooling, the gradual evolution, the development of atmospheres and climates, and on at least one world, life. The young Earth was nothing like the world we know. The atmosphere was thick with carbon dioxide and nitrogen, water vapor, perhaps methane. No oxygen. Not yet. The surface was molten, or nearly so, cooling from the heat of formation and bombardment. Volcanic activity everywhere. The sky dark, the sun appearing dimmer through the haze. But water was there, somehow, either delivered by comets and asteroids from the outer solar system, or released from minerals in Earth's rocks, or both, and as the surface cooled, the water vapor condensed, fell as rain that may have lasted for thousands of years, filling the low places, forming the first oceans, and in those oceans, in some way we still don't fully understand, chemistry became biology. Molecules organized themselves into systems that could replicate, that could metabolize, that could evolve. And the story that began with a collapsing cloud of gas became a story of life, though that chapter belongs to Earth alone, as far as we know, the only inhabited world in our solar family. The other worlds followed their own paths, each one a laboratory of physics and chemistry, each one conducting its own experiment in planetary evolution. Mercury, closest to the sun, smallest of the true planets, became a world of extremes, its surface baked and frozen in turn, because with almost no atmosphere to hold heat, the day side soars to 430 degrees Celsius, while the night side plunges to minus 180, a swing of more than 600 degrees, the greatest temperature variation of any planet. Its core is enormous, proportionally, making up perhaps 60 to 70% of the planet's mass, which suggests that Mercury either formed from unusually metal-rich material, or that something stripped away much of its rocky mantle early in its history, perhaps a giant impact similar to the one that formed Earth's moon, or perhaps the intense heat and solar wind from the young sun simply vaporized the outer layers. The surface is ancient, heavily cratered, looking much like our moon, because without an atmosphere, without plate tectonics, without water, there's nothing to erase the scars. Every impact remains, a geological record stretching back billions of years. And there are strange features, long cliff faces called scarps, sometimes hundreds of kilometers long and up to a kilometer high, thought to be wrinkles in the planet's crust, formed as the interior cooled and contracted, shrinking Mercury like a raisin, its solid shell buckling under the compression. Venus, the second planet, became something else entirely, a cautionary tale about greenhouse effects, about how a world similar in size and composition to Earth could evolve into something hellish. Early Venus may have had oceans, water on its surface. For perhaps the first 2 billion years of its existence, but being closer to the sun, it received more solar energy, which meant more evaporation, more water vapor in the atmosphere, and water vapor is a greenhouse gas, trapping heat, causing more evaporation, a runaway feedback loop. Eventually the oceans boiled away. The water vapor rose high into the atmosphere, where ultraviolet light from the sun split it into hydrogen and oxygen. The light hydrogen escaped to space, the oxygen bound to rocks on the surface, and the water was gone. lost forever. What remained was carbon dioxide released from volcanic activity, with no water to dissolve it, no life to absorb it, no weathering cycle to lock it into rock. It accumulated, building an atmosphere 90 times denser than Earth's, thick enough that the pressure at the surface is like being a kilometer underwater. And that atmosphere traps heat with brutal efficiency, raising surface temperatures to 465 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead, hot enough that the rock itself glows a dull red, and the clouds, those beautiful clouds that make Venus so bright in our sky, are made of sulfuric acid, raining down but evaporating before reaching the ground. The surface is young, geologically speaking, only about 500 million years old, which suggests that Venus resurfaces itself, perhaps through massive volcanic events that cover the entire planet, or through a different kind of tectonics, not plates sliding over each other as on Earth, but single plate tectonics, where the entire crust periodically founders, sinking into the mantle, replaced by fresh lava. Mars, the fourth planet, took another path. It started with advantages. A day almost the same length as Earth's, an axis tilted similarly, given it seasons, and evidence suggests it once had liquid water on its surface, rivers carved valleys, water collected in impact craters, minerals formed that require water to exist. But Mars is small, only about a half Earth's diameter, a tenth of Earth's mass, and that mattered enormously because a planet's size determines how long it can retain its internal heat, and heat drives geological activity, which drives magnetic fields, which protect atmospheres from being stripped away by solar wind. Mars cooled faster, its core solidified, or at least became too sluggish to generate a strong magnetic field, and without that protection, the solar wind gradually stripped away its atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years, like wind eroding soil from a hillside, grain by grain, molecule by molecule. As the atmosphere thinned, the pressure dropped, and liquid water became unstable. It either froze into the ground, becoming permafrost, or sublimated directly into vapor and was lost to space. The riverbeds dried, the lakes evaporated, the planet grew cold and still. Now Mars is a desert, though perhaps not entirely dead. There may be liquid water deep underground, heated by residual warmth from the core and the polar ice caps, made of water ice and frozen carbon dioxide, grow and shrink with the seasons, one of the few active processes still occurring. The surface tells stories. Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system, rises 21 kilometers above the surrounding plains, nearly 3 times the height of Mount Everest, and it's a shield volcano built by countless eruptions of low-viscosity lava, piling up over millions of years, made possible because Mars lacks plate tectonics. The volcano stayed over its hotspot, growing and growing. Valles Marineris, the Great Canyon system, stretches 4,000 kilometers along the Martian equator, up to 7 kilometers deep in places. If it were on Earth, it would span from New York to Los Angeles, carved perhaps by tectonic activity or erosion, or a combination of both, a scar across a hemisphere. Beyond Mars, beyond the asteroid belt, where thousands of rocky fragments orbit, some as small as pebbles, some as large as mountains, we come to Jupiter, the king of planets, the giant among giants. Jupiter is not like the inner worlds, not a ball of rock with a thin atmosphere but the reverse, a vast sphere of gas, mostly hydrogen and helium, the same material that makes up stars, and deep within, under crushing pressure, hydrogen takes on strange properties, becoming metallic, conducting electricity, generating Jupiter's powerful magnetic field, the strongest of any planet. The atmosphere is all we can see, bands of clouds, creams and browns and reds, moving in opposite directions, some flowing east, some west. Driven by the planet's rapid rotation, Jupiter spins faster than any other planet, a day lasting less than 10 hours. Despite being 11 times wider than Earth, this speed flattens it slightly, making it visibly oblate, wider at the equator than pole to pole. In those bands, storms rage and have raged for centuries. The Great Red Spot, an anticyclonic storm larger than Earth, has been observed since at least 1630, possibly longer, spinning counterclockwise, completing one rotation every 6 days, with wind speeds reaching 430 kilometers per hour. The spot changes. It's shrinking. Measurements from the 1800s show it was 4 times wider than Earth. Now it's only slightly larger, and no one knows why, whether it will disappear entirely or stabilize or oscillate in size. Jupiter keeps its secrets. Beneath the visible atmosphere, pressure and temperature increase, deeper and deeper. There may be no solid surface at all, just a gradual transition from gas to liquid to metallic hydrogen, and at the very center, perhaps a rocky core, 10 to 20 times Earth's mass, though even this is uncertain. Our models struggle with the conditions that exist in Jupiter's interior. The planet has rings, faint ones, made of dust from micrometeorite impacts on its inner moons. And speaking of moons, Jupiter has at least 95 of them, though most are tiny, captured asteroids, irregular in shape, but 4 are worlds in their own right. Io, the innermost, is the most volcanically active body in the solar system, its surface constantly reshaped by eruptions, plumes of sulfur and sulfur dioxide shooting hundreds of kilometers into space, all because Jupiter's gravity and the gravitational pulls of the other large moons flex Io like a stress ball, squeezing it, heating its interior through tidal friction. Europa, the second, is an ice world, its surface crisscrossed with cracks and ridges, almost no craters, which means the surface is young, constantly renewed, and beneath that ice, perhaps 15 to 25 kilometers thick, there may be an ocean, liquid water, kept warm by tidal heating, containing twice as much water as all of Earth's oceans combined. Ganymede, the third, is the largest moon in the solar system, bigger than Mercury, with its own magnetic field, the only moon known to have one. Its surface is a mix of old, dark terrain and younger grooved terrain, suggesting a complex geological history. Callisto, the fourth, is heavily cratered, ancient, geologically dead, or nearly so, its surface a record of 4 billion years of impacts. But even Callisto may hide an ocean beneath its battered crust, kept liquid by heat from radioactive decay in its rocky core. Saturn, the sixth planet, the jewel of the solar system, is similar to Jupiter in composition, mostly hydrogen and helium, but smaller, less massive, less dense, so much less dense that if you could find an ocean large enough, Saturn would float. It spins rapidly, too, a day lasting just 10.5 hours, and like Jupiter, it has atmospheric bands, though softer in color, creams and pale golds, with occasional storms, some of which appear as white spots, eruptions of ammonia or ice crystals from deeper layers. But what makes Saturn truly remarkable, what captures every eye that sees it through a telescope, are the rings. Vast, impossibly thin, stretching hundreds of thousands of kilometers from the planet, but only tens of meters thick in most places, like a cosmic phonograph record. The rings are made of ice, billions of particles, ranging from dust grain size to house-sized chunks, each one an individual moon, orbiting Saturn in its own path. And they're young, relatively speaking, perhaps only 100 million years old, which raises the question of where they came from. Maybe a moon wandered too close, crossed the Roche limit, the distance at which tidal forces overcome a body's self-gravity, and was torn apart. Or maybe a comet was captured and shattered. Or maybe a collision between moons created the debris. Whatever the origin, the result is breathtaking. The rings are separated into bands with gaps between them, the Cassini division, the Encke gap, cleared by the gravitational influence of Saturn's moons, some of which orbit within the rings themselves. Shepherd moons, their gravity sculpting the ring edges, keeping them sharp. Saturn has even more moons than Jupiter, at least 146 at last count, many discovered only recently. Tiny things, but some are substantial. Titan, the largest, is bigger than Mercury, with a thick atmosphere, mostly nitrogen, and lakes on its surface. Not water, but liquid methane and ethane, the only other place in the solar system with stable bodies of liquid on its surface. Enceladus, tiny by comparison, barely 500 kilometers across, became one of the most intriguing discoveries of our age, because this small frozen moon, orbiting in the outer reaches of Saturn's system, is shooting geysers of water ice into space, plumes that spray from cracks near its south pole, fed by an ocean beneath its icy shell, warmed by tidal heating, just like Europa, another world with the ingredients for life hiding beneath a frozen surface. Beyond Saturn, the solar system grows darker, colder, the sun appears smaller, its warmth diminished, and here we find Uranus, the seventh planet, a world tilted on its side. Something massive struck Uranus early in its history, knocked it over, so that its axis of rotation lies almost in the plane of its orbit, where other planets spin like tops. Uranus rolls like a ball, its poles pointing toward and away from the sun as it orbits, creating the strangest seasons imaginable. Each pole experiences 42 years of continuous sunlight, followed by 42 years of continuous darkness, and the planet takes 84 years to complete one orbit. So each hemisphere gets one long summer, one long winter, and 2 brief spring and autumn periods, all stretched across human lifetimes. Uranus is an ice giant, distinct from the gas giants, smaller, with less hydrogen and helium proportionally, and more of what astronomers call ices, water, ammonia, methane, though under the pressures inside Uranus, these substances exist in exotic states, hot, dense fluids, perhaps superionic water, where oxygen forms a crystal lattice while hydrogen ions flow freely through it, conducting electricity, generating the planet's magnetic field. That magnetic field is strange, tilted 59 degrees from the planet's axis of rotation and offset from the center, as if the field is generated not in the core but in a shell around it, and it wobbles dramatically as the planet rotates, creating a magnetic environment unlike anywhere else we know. The atmosphere is mostly hydrogen and helium, with about 2% methane, and it's that methane that gives Uranus its blue-green color. Methane absorbs red light, reflects blue, painting the planet in soft aquamarine hues, featureless to the eye, though modern telescopes reveal faint bands and occasional storms in infrared wavelengths. Uranus has rings too, dark, thin rings, discovered only in 1977, when the planet passed in front of a star and astronomers noticed the starlight flickering, dimming briefly, multiple times, before and after Uranus itself blocked the star, revealing rings we'd never seen before. And it has moons, 27 known, named not for Greek and Roman deities like most solar system objects, but for characters from Shakespeare and Alexander Pope: Miranda, Ariel, Umbriel, Titania, Oberon, the 5 largest, each with its own character, its own history written in ice and rock. Miranda, the smallest of the large moons, has the most tortured surface, vast canyons, cliffs 20 kilometers high, regions of completely different terrain meeting at sharp boundaries, as if the moon was shattered, then reassembled, though the true explanation probably involves tidal heating and cryovolcanism, ice volcanoes, erupting slushes of water and ammonia instead of molten rock. Neptune, the 8th planet, the last of the giants, was found not by searching the sky, but by mathematics. Astronomers noticed that Uranus's orbit wasn't quite right. Something was pulling on it, perturbing its path, and by calculating where that something must be, they pointed their telescopes, and there it was, Neptune, exactly where the equations predicted. Neptune is similar to Uranus in size and composition, another ice giant, but its atmosphere is more active, storms visible even from Earth. The Great Dark Spot, discovered by Voyager 2 in 1989, was an anticyclonic storm similar to Jupiter's Great Red Spot, though it disappeared within a few years. Unlike Jupiter's persistent feature, wind speeds on Neptune are the highest in the solar system, reaching 2,000 kilometers per hour, faster than the speed of sound on Earth, driven by some internal heat source we don't fully understand, because Neptune radiates more than twice as much heat as it receives from the Sun, even though it's 30 times farther from the Sun than Earth, receiving 900 times less sunlight. Neptune's largest moon, Triton, is strange among large moons because it orbits backward, retrograde, opposite to Neptune's rotation, which means it wasn't formed alongside the planet, but was captured, probably from the Kuiper Belt, making it a distant cousin of Pluto, a Kuiper Belt object that wandered too close and was snared by Neptune's gravity. Triton is geologically active. Its surface is young, only a few million years at most, with nitrogen geysers that erupt through the ice, creating dark streaks on the surface, and it's spiraling slowly inward, tidal forces gradually slowing its orbit. In a few billion years it will cross Neptune's Roche limit and be torn apart, forming perhaps the most spectacular ring system in the solar system, though there will be no one to see it. Beyond Neptune, in the cold dark reaches past the orbits of the planets, lies the Kuiper Belt, a disk of icy bodies, remnants from the solar system's formation, never gathered into planets, too distant, too sparse, too disturbed by Neptune's migration. Here we find Pluto, once called the 9th planet, now designated a dwarf planet, not because it's small, though it is smaller than Earth's moon, but because it hasn't cleared its orbital neighborhood. It shares the Kuiper Belt with thousands of similar objects, Haumea, Makemake, Eris, and countless smaller bodies. Pluto itself is a complex world, despite its size, with mountains of water ice as hard as rock in the cold, plains of nitrogen ice that flow like glaciers, a tenuous atmosphere that freezes and falls as snow when Pluto moves farther from the Sun in its elliptical orbit, then sublimates again as it approaches. It has 5 moons. The largest, Charon, is so big relative to Pluto that they form a binary system orbiting a common center of gravity that lies between them, not inside Pluto. 2 worlds locked face to face, each always showing the same hemisphere to the other, dancing together through the dark. And farther still, beyond the Kuiper Belt, beyond the scattered disk, where objects on highly elliptical orbits loop in and out, there is the Oort cloud, theoretical, never directly observed, but inferred from the comets that fall toward the Sun from every direction, from a spherical shell surrounding the entire solar system. The Oort cloud may contain trillions of icy bodies, extending perhaps halfway to the nearest star, a light-year or more from the Sun, barely bound by gravity, easily perturbed by passing stars, by the tidal force of the galaxy itself, and when perturbed, these objects fall inward, taking thousands or millions of years to reach the inner solar system, where the Sun's heat vaporizes their ices, creating the tales we see, the comets that have terrified and inspired humans throughout history. Between all these worlds, filling the spaces, is dust, gas, the solar wind, particles streaming from the Sun, protons and electrons, creating a bubble called the heliosphere, which protects the solar system from interstellar radiation. The heliosphere extends far beyond Pluto, beyond the Kuiper Belt, to the heliopause, where the solar wind finally meets the interstellar medium and stops, compressed, deflected, marking the boundary between what belongs to the Sun and what belongs to the galaxy. 2 spacecraft have crossed that boundary, Voyager 1 in 2012, Voyager 2 in 2018, carrying with them golden records, messages from humanity, sounds and images, music and greetings in multiple languages, just in case someone finds them, billions of years from now, when the Sun has changed, when Earth may no longer exist. These artifacts will still be drifting, ambassadors to deep time. The solar system is not static, not frozen in time. It continues to evolve. The Sun is slowly brightening, about 10% brighter now than when it formed, and it will continue to brighten in 1 billion years, perhaps less. Earth's oceans will boil away, the planet becoming another Venus, uninhabitable, and the habitable zone will shift outward, perhaps to Mars, perhaps to the moons of Jupiter. In 5 billion years, give or take, the Sun will exhaust the hydrogen in its core. Fusion will slow, the core will contract, heat, and fusion will begin in a shell around the core. The Sun will swell, becoming a red giant, its outer layers expanding, engulfing Mercury, perhaps Venus, perhaps Earth, though by then Earth will long since have lost its oceans, its atmosphere, any trace of the life that once flourished there. Saturn's rings will be gone, dispersed by collisions, by radiation, by the slow grinding of time. Triton will have spiraled into Neptune and been destroyed. Mars will have cooled completely, its core frozen solid, and the dance of the planets will continue, slower, colder, darker, until the sun sheds its outer layers, becomes a white dwarf, a dense ember slowly cooling, and the planets orbit in eternal twilight. But that is far ahead, unimaginably far. For now, the solar system is in its middle age, stable, mature, its violent youth behind it, and on one small world, circling an ordinary star in an unremarkable part of the galaxy, life has emerged, evolved, developed consciousness, and looked outward, mapping the cosmic neighborhood, sending probes to distant worlds, asking questions about origins and endings, finding in the solar system both a mirror and a mystery. We've sent our eyes and ears outward, built machines that can withstand radiation and cold and the vast emptiness between worlds, and through them we've touched the surfaces of places humans may never walk. We've landed rovers on Mars, watched them crawl across rust-colored plains, drill into rocks, analyze soil, search for signs that life once existed there or might still exist, hidden underground, waiting. We've dropped a probe through Titan's atmosphere, watched it descend by parachute through orange haze, landed on a shore beside a methane sea, saw rocks made of ice, sand made of organic molecules, a world so strange and yet so familiar, with weather and seasons and lakes, just made of different substances, operating at temperatures where water is stone and methane flows like water. We've flown past Pluto, New Horizons spacecraft, taken 9.5 years to reach it, and in those few hours of closest approach, transformed Pluto from a fuzzy dot in our best telescopes to a real place, with mountains and glaciers and a heart-shaped plain of frozen nitrogen, revealing that even in the outermost reaches, worlds are more complex than we imagined. We've sent Cassini to orbit Saturn for 13 years, watching the seasons change, studying the rings in detail never before possible, discovering new moons, new structures, before finally, running low on fuel, commanded to dive into Saturn's atmosphere, to burn up, to become part of the world it studied, ensuring it wouldn't accidentally contaminate any moon where life might exist. And all of this, every mission, every discovery, adds layers to our understanding, but also reveals how much we don't know, how many mysteries remain. We don't know exactly how planets form. We have models, theories, simulations, but watching it happen is impossible. It takes millions of years, and we've only been looking at other star systems for a few decades, finding thousands of exoplanets, worlds around other stars, some similar to Jupiter, some to Earth, some unlike anything in our solar system. Hot Jupiters orbiting closer to their stars than Mercury orbits the Sun, super-Earths, mini-Neptunes, categories we never needed before. And these discoveries make our solar system seem both ordinary and special. Ordinary because planets are common. Most stars have them. Special because every system is different, shaped by the particular conditions of its formation, the mass of material available, the presence or absence of giant planets, the history of collisions and migrations. We don't know if life exists elsewhere in our solar system. The conditions are there, on Europa, on Enceladus, on Titan, perhaps. Liquid water, organic molecules, energy sources, the ingredients we think are necessary, but necessary is not sufficient. And searching is difficult. These oceans are buried beneath kilometers of ice. Reaching them will require technology we're still developing. We don't know what causes Jupiter's great red spot to persist while other storms fade. We don't know why Uranus and Neptune radiate more heat than they receive. We don't know if Saturn's rings are unique or if they cycle, forming, dispersing, reforming over billions of years. Every answer breeds new questions, deeper questions, and that's perhaps the most profound thing about exploring the solar system. It teaches us humility, shows us that nature is more creative than our theories, more complex than our models, always surprising us, always holding something back. The solar system is a reminder of scale, of time, of our place in the cosmos. Earth is tiny, a mote of dust in a vast space, and yet it's everything to us, the only home we've ever known, and looking at other worlds, seeing their desolation, their beauty, their strangeness, makes Earth seem more precious, more fragile. We are the universe becoming aware of itself. Star stuff contemplating stars, and in studying the solar system, we're studying our origins, because everything here came from that original nebula, including us, the calcium in our bones formed in dying stars, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our cells, all of it forged in stellar furnaces, scattered by supernovae, gathered by gravity, shaped by time into planets and moons, and eventually, impossibly, life. There's something profound about standing on Earth and looking at Mars, knowing that the same laws of physics govern both, the same chemistry, the same fundamental forces, and yet the outcomes are so different. One world living, one world dead, or mostly dead, separated by such a small difference in size, in distance from the sun, showing us how contingent everything is, how delicate the balance, and there's something humbling about the timescales. 4.5 billion years, a span so long that all of human history, all of recorded civilization, fits into the last few seconds. If you compress the solar system's age into a single day, we are newcomers, late arrivals, witnesses to a story already billions of years in the telling. The solar system will outlast us, almost certainly, even if we spread to other worlds, even if we become a truly spacefaring species. The sun's lifespan is measured in billions of years, and civilizations, we don't know. We have no data. We're the only one we've found, and we've only been technological for a few centuries. A blink, less than a blink. But right now, in this moment, we're here, looking outward, asking questions, sending our instruments to touch distant worlds. And there's something beautiful in that, something defiant, refusing to accept ignorance, refusing to be content with just our own small world, reaching beyond, always reaching. The solar system continues its ancient dance, indifferent to us, following the mathematics of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, playing out the consequences of its formation, slowly evolving towards some distant future we can model but never see. And we continue watching, learning, piecing together the story, finding in the other worlds both mirrors and warnings, seeing what Earth might have been, might become, using the solar system as a laboratory to understand planetary science, climate, geology, the conditions for life. Sometimes I imagine standing on another world, looking back at Earth, seeing it as a pale blue dot, the way the Voyager spacecraft photographed it from the edge of the solar system, and feeling that mixture of loneliness and connection, knowing that everything I've ever known, everyone I've ever loved, every human who has ever lived, is on that tiny pixel of light suspended in a sunbeam, as Carl Sagan said, fragile, temporary, precious beyond measure. The solar system has been our teacher, showing us that we're part of something larger, that Earth is not the center but one world among many, that the universe operates on scales of time and space that dwarf human experience, and yet, somehow, we've learned to comprehend it, to measure it, to send our creations across billions of kilometers, to stand in spirit, if not in body, on alien shores. Tonight, looking up, I see the planets as wandering lights again. Venus bright in the evening, Jupiter rising later, Mars a rust-colored spark, and I know them now, not as gods, not as mysterious fires, but as worlds, real places with mountains and valleys, storms and seasons, each one a chapter in the story that began with a collapsing cloud, the story that includes us, the story that continues. The distances are vast, the timescales immense, the mysteries profound, and yet, now we're here, small creatures on a small world, looking outward, understanding, wondering, carrying forward the impulse that has driven us since we first looked up, the desire to know, to explore, to comprehend our place in this grand cosmic dance. And in that desire, in that reaching outward, we fulfill something essential, something that connects us to the stars themselves, because we are made of star stuff, organized into patterns that can think, that can wonder, that can build spacecraft and write equations and dream of walking on distant worlds. The solar system turns, patient, eternal, indifferent, and beautiful beyond words, a family of worlds bound by gravity and history, each one unique, each one a world entire, and we, brief as we are, have learned to read their surfaces, to understand their atmospheres, to piece together their stories, and in doing so, we've learned to read our own story, to understand where we came from, and perhaps where we're going. The night deepens, the stars grow brighter, and somewhere out there, beyond Neptune, beyond Pluto, the Voyager spacecraft continue their journey, carrying messages from Earth, silent ambassadors drifting toward other stars, reaching the heliopause, crossing into interstellar space, leaving behind the solar system, but carrying its story with them and ours into the dark, into the endless night between stars, into whatever comes next. There is a particular quiet that belongs to Saturday mornings, a hush that seems woven from something older than memory, something that carries the weight of ritual and the lightness of anticipation all at once. And in that quiet, before the world becomes fully awake, there exists a threshold, a place where time moves differently, where the television screen glows with a gentle luminescence, casting soft blue light across darkened living rooms, across bowls of cereal that sit waiting, across pajama-clad children who have risen before their parents, drawn by something they cannot quite name. The history of Saturday morning television cartoons is not simply a chronicle of entertainment. It is a map of childhood itself, charted across decades, drawn in bold primary colors, and set to music that still echoes in corridors of collective memory. And to trace this history is to walk backwards through time, through layers of cultural change, through shifting technologies and evolving sensibilities, until we arrive at a moment when broadcasting networks first recognize the strange magic of this particular day, this particular time slot, when the adult world still slumbered and children commanded the airwaves. There is something almost archaeological about this journey, as if we are sifting through strata of animation cells and broadcast schedules, uncovering the remnants of Saturday morning's past, each layer revealing something about the era that produced it, about what children were thought to need, what they were believed to desire, and what stories were deemed suitable for their consumption in those precious hours between dawn and noon. The glow of the television in a dark room has its own quality, distinct from any other light. It flickers and pulses with the rhythm of the broadcast, creating shadows that dance along walls. And in the 1950s and 1960s, when this phenomenon first began to take shape, that glow represented something revolutionary, a new kind of gathering place, a digital hearth around which a generation would assemble without fully understanding that they were participating in the birth of a tradition. Before Saturday mornings became synonymous with cartoons, before the ritual solidified into something that felt eternal and unchanging, there was simply television itself, still new, still finding its way, still learning what it could be and what it might become. And the networks, those great broadcasting entities with their towers and transmission signals reaching across cities and states, were conducting a vast experiment, testing boundaries, exploring possibilities, searching for audiences in every conceivable time slot and demographic category. Children, it turned out, were early risers, particularly on weekends when school released its grip and time stretched out with seemingly infinite possibility. And while parents sought the luxury of sleeping late on Saturday mornings, their offspring were awake, alert, and in need of something to occupy their attention. This presented both a challenge and an opportunity for broadcasters who saw in this situation the potential for a captive audience, young viewers whose loyalty might be cultivated, whose preferences might be shaped, whose Saturday mornings might be claimed. The cartoons that would come to fill these hours were descendants of theatrical shorts, those brief animated films that had once played before feature presentations in movie houses across the country. Characters like Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, Tom and Jerry, Woody Woodpecker, had been born for the big screen, crafted by studios with names that would become legendary: Warner Brothers, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Walter Lantz Productions. These were animations designed for general audiences, family entertainment that parents and children might enjoy together in the dark sanctuary of a theater. But television demanded something different. It required content that could fill hours rather than minutes, that could be produced economically, that could be broadcast repeatedly without exhausting its appeal. And so began a transformation, a reimagining of what animation could be, what it might become when freed from the constraints of theatrical exhibition and remade for the small screen, for the intimacy of the living room, for children watching alone or with siblings, without adult supervision or mediation. The technology itself was evolving. Animation techniques were adapting to new requirements, to smaller budgets and faster production schedules, to the limitations and possibilities of broadcast television. Artists and studios were learning to work within these constraints, discovering efficiencies, developing shortcuts, creating new aesthetic approaches that would define the look and feel of television animation for decades to come. And threading through all of this, through the business decisions and technological adaptations, through the creative innovations and the commercial calculations, there runs a narrative about childhood itself, about what it means to be young in America, about the stories we tell our children and the values we embed within those stories, about imagination and commerce, education and entertainment, all converging in that magical window of time on Saturday mornings when the screen glowed and anything seemed possible. The story truly begins in the years immediately following the Second World War, when television itself was still finding its footing in American homes, still proving its worth as more than a novelty, still establishing the patterns and rhythms that would come to define it in those early years. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, television programming followed the contours of radio, borrowing formats, adapting familiar shows, creating schedules that mirrored the patterns already established through sound alone. Saturday mornings, in those pioneer days of broadcasting, belonged largely to agricultural programming, to shows designed for rural audiences who rose with the sun regardless of the day. There were farm reports and livestock updates, discussions of seed prices and weather patterns, content that served a specific demographic and purpose, but left vast swaths of the viewing audience, particularly the young, entirely unserved. The networks in those years were few. NBC and CBS dominated the landscape. ABC existed but struggled to compete, and Dumont, a network now largely forgotten, fought for survival in a rapidly consolidating industry. Each of these entities operated under different constraints, different philosophies, different visions of what television might become. And it was within this competitive environment that the Saturday morning landscape would begin to take shape. The first tentative steps toward children's programming on Saturday mornings came not from animation, but from live-action shows, programs that featured hosts and studio audiences, that incorporated games and contests, that brought a circus-like atmosphere to the small screen. Shows like Big Top, which aired on CBS beginning in 1950, brought the spectacle of the circus into living rooms, complete with clowns and acrobats, lions and elephants, all contained within the modest frame of a television screen. These early children's shows understood something fundamental about their audience, that children craved spectacle, movement, surprise, elements that live performance could provide, but that required considerable resources and careful choreography. The logistics of producing such shows week after week, of maintaining the energy and novelty, proved challenging and expensive, and the networks began searching for alternatives, for content that could be produced more economically, that could be repeated without losing its appeal, that could fill hours rather than minutes. Animation emerged as the answer, but not animation created specifically for television, at least not at first. The studios that had produced theatrical cartoons for decades possessed vast libraries of existing content, shorts that had already been shown in theaters, that had already earned their initial revenue, and that now sat in vaults, waiting. These cartoons represented a ready-made solution to the problem of Saturday morning programming, content that could be acquired relatively inexpensively, that required no ongoing production costs, that children had either never seen or would happily watch again. Warner Brothers was among the first to recognize this opportunity. The studio's Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons featuring characters already beloved by multiple generations, began appearing on television in the mid-1950s. These were not the full theatrical shorts in many cases, but rather edited versions, trimmed to fit television time slots, altered to accommodate commercial breaks, adapted to the technical requirements of the broadcast medium. The transition was not seamless. Theatrical cartoons had been designed for large screens, for audiences sitting in darkened theaters, for viewing experiences that were communal and occasional. Television required something different. It demanded content that could work on smaller screens, that could be watched casually, that could be interrupted without losing narrative coherence, and so the cartoons were modified, their pacing adjusted, their content sometimes altered to suit the sensibilities of network censors who worried about violence and behavior they deemed inappropriate for unsupervised young viewers. CBS made a significant move in 1955 with The Mighty Mouse Playhouse. This was something new, a program built entirely around existing theatrical cartoons featuring the caped rodent superhero, but presented with a host, with linking segments, with an attempt to create a show. Rather than simply broadcasting a series of disconnected shorts, the format proved successful, drawing audiences, attracting sponsors, demonstrating that Saturday mornings could be profitable territory for networks willing to invest in children's programming. The host, in this case a live actor interacting with animated elements, provided continuity, created a sense of occasion, made the viewing experience feel special rather than random. This model would be replicated and refined over subsequent years, becoming a template for how to package animated content for television audiences, how to transform individual cartoons into cohesive programs that could command regular viewership and generate advertising revenue. NBC entered the field with The Rough and Ready Show in 1957, and this marked another crucial development because Rough and Ready were not theatrical characters being repurposed for television. They were created specifically for the small screen by William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, animators who had spent years at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer creating Tom and Jerry shorts, but who now found themselves independent, forming their own studio, and pioneering a new approach to animation designed explicitly for television's unique demands. Hanna-Barbera revolutionized television animation through what they termed limited animation, a technique that reduced the number of individual drawings required for each second of screen time. Theatrical cartoons have been produced using full animation, with characters rendered in elaborate detail, moving with fluid grace, every gesture and expression carefully crafted. But this approach was prohibitively expensive for television, where budgets were constrained and production schedules relentless. Limited animation employed strategies to reduce costs while maintaining visual appeal. Backgrounds remained static while characters moved against them. Characters were designed with separate heads and bodies, so that only the speaking mouth needed to be redrawn for dialogue scenes. Action was suggested rather than shown in full detail. Walk cycles were shortened and repeated, and storytelling relied more heavily on dialogue and sound effects to compensate for reduced visual movement. Critics would later argue that limited animation represented a degradation, a cheapening of the art form, and there was truth in this assessment. The technique did sacrifice the fluid grace of theatrical animation, the elaborate sight gags, the virtuosic displays of drawing skill. but it also made television animation economically viable. It allowed for the creation of new characters and new stories specifically designed for young audiences watching at home on Saturday mornings. And in this trade-off, something was gained even as something else was lost. The Huckleberry Hound show debuted in 1958, also from Hanna-Barbera, and became a phenomenon. The blue dog with the southern drawl and easygoing demeanor captured something essential about the late 1950s, a kind of gentle humor, a resistance to conflict, a world where problems were small and solutions always within reach. The show was syndicated, meaning it appeared on different stations at different times rather than on a single network, but it found its natural home in morning and early afternoon time slots, particularly on Saturdays. Accompanying Huckleberry Hound were other characters who would become fixtures of the era. Yogi Bear, a smarter-than-average bear residing in Jellystone Park, constantly scheming to separate tourists from their picnic baskets while evading Ranger Smith, and Pixie and Dixie, two mice tormented by Mr. Jinx, a cat whose antagonism was always tempered by affection. These characters inhabited a safe world, a world where violence had no consequences, where pursuit never ended in capture, where tomorrow would bring the same cheerful conflicts as today. The success of Hanna-Barbera's approach prompted other studios to enter television animation. J. Ward Productions created Rocky and His Friends in 1959, featuring the adventures of Arcasius Rocky the Flying Squirrel and Bullwinkle the Moose, along with supporting segments like Fractured Fairy Tales and Peabody's Improbable History. Ward's sensibility was different from Hanna-Barbera's, more satirical, more willing to include jokes aimed at adults, more self-aware about the absurdity of the animated medium itself. The animation in Rocky and Bullwinkle was even more limited than Hanna-Barbera's work, almost crude by theatrical standards, but the writing was sharp, the wordplay clever, the serialized storylines with their cliffhanger endings created appointment viewing. Children tuned in not just for the characters but to see how the story would continue, how Rocky and Bullwinkle would escape their latest predicament, how Boris Badenov and Natasha Fatali's schemes would be foiled. By the end of the 1950s, Saturday morning television had begun to establish itself as a distinct phenomenon, a time when children could claim the television for themselves, when programming was designed specifically for their interests and attention spans, when the adult world receded and a child's world, colorful and uncomplicated, filled the screen. The networks had discovered that this audience was valuable, that sponsors would pay to reach children, that entire product lines could be marketed during these hours, and that the cartoons themselves could become vehicles for merchandising, for selling toys and cereals and lunchboxes bearing the likenesses of beloved characters. The foundation had been laid, the economic model established, the creative approaches developed, and as the calendar turned to a new decade, as the 1960s began, Saturday morning cartoons stood poised to enter what would later be probably remembered as a golden age, an era of expansion and innovation when new characters would multiply across the dial, when the format would solidify into ritual, when millions of children would gather each week before glowing screens, drawn by something that had barely existed a decade before, but that now seemed as eternal and necessary as Saturday morning itself. The 1960s arrived with a kind of technicolor exuberance, a sense that television had matured enough to take risks, to experiment, to push beyond the simple formulas that had defined the previous decade. And nowhere was this more evident than in the explosion of animated programming that began to fill Saturday mornings, transforming them from a collection of scattered offerings into a carefully orchestrated block of entertainment, designed to capture young viewers from the moment they opened their eyes until well past noon. In 1960, Hanna-Barbera premiered The Flintstones in prime time, an animated sitcom aimed at adults, featuring a Stone Age family whose adventures parodied contemporary suburban life. But the show's success demonstrated something crucial: that animation could appeal to broad audiences, that it could sustain narrative complexity, that it could become a weekly habit for viewers across demographics. And while The Flintstones aired in the evening, its influence rippled into Saturday morning programming, encouraging networks to invest more heavily in animated content, to see it as something more than mere babysitting for children whose parents wanted to sleep late. The early 1960s saw an acceleration, a proliferation of new shows and new characters. The Yogi Bear show spun off from Huckleberry Hound in 1961, giving the picnic basket-stealing bear his own program, complete with supporting characters like Snagglepuss, a pink mountain lion with theatrical aspirations and a tendency to exit stage left, and Top Cat, which debuted the same year, featuring an alley cat and his gang navigating the streets of New York, their schemes and scams echoing the urban comedy of the Phil Silvers show, but rendered in animation. What distinguished these shows from their predecessors was an increasing sophistication in storytelling. Characters developed recognizable personalities. Episodes followed coherent narrative arcs. The worlds they inhabited felt consistent, governed by their own internal logic. Children watching could anticipate how characters would behave, could predict plot developments, could feel the satisfaction of expectations confirmed or the delight of surprise when stories took unexpected turns. The production process itself became more streamlined, more efficient. Hanna-Barbera operated like a factory, churning out enormous quantities of animation through assembly line methods. Background artists created libraries of reusable settings. Character designers developed models that could be replicated quickly. Voice actors recorded dialogue for multiple characters in single sessions. The studio's output was prodigious, at times producing more animated content in a year than all the theatrical cartoon studios had produced in a decade. Other studios watched Hanna-Barbera's success and sought to replicate it. Filmation Associates, founded in 1962 by Lou Scheimer and Hal Sutherland, entered the Saturday morning landscape with shows like The New Adventures of Superman in 1966, bringing the DC comic superhero to television in animated form. The show marked a shift toward action-oriented programming, toward stories of heroes and villains, conflicts resolved through strength and courage rather than clever schemes or lucky accidents. Superheroes began to dominate Saturday mornings in the mid-1960s. The Marvel superheroes debuted in 1966, presenting Captain America, Iron Man, the Hulk, Thor, and Submariner in barely animated segments that often consisted of comic book panels with minimal movement. The technique was crude even by limited animation standards, but children didn't seem to mind. They were captivated by the characters, by the mythology, by the ongoing battles between good and evil that stretched across episodes and story arcs. CBS launched its Superhero Saturday lineup in 1967, a coordinated block of programming featuring multiple superhero shows back-to-back, creating an event out of Saturday morning viewing. The network recognized that children would remain loyal to a channel if given a compelling reason. If the transition from one show to the next felt seamless, if leaving meant missing something important, and so the strategy of block programming began to take shape, transforming Saturday mornings from a loose collection of individual shows into a carefully designed experience. Space Ghost arrived in 1966 from Hanna-Barbera, representing the studio's entry into the superhero genre. The caped cosmic crime fighter traveled through space with teenage sidekicks Jan and Jace, accompanied by a monkey named Blip, battling intergalactic villains with the help of power bands that gave him various abilities. The show's design aesthetic, with its bold lines and dramatic color schemes, its space-age architecture and alien landscapes, captured the era's fascination with the cosmos, with the space race that dominated headlines, with the possibility of worlds beyond our own. The music that accompanied these shows deserves particular attention, for it became inseparable from the experience of Saturday morning viewing. Composers created theme songs designed to burrow into young minds, to be hummed and sung throughout the week, to create instant recognition and anticipation. The Spider-Man theme that debuted in 1967 with the character's animated series became perhaps the most enduring of all, its lyrics explaining the hero's powers and motivations in catchy verse, its melody infectious and impossible to forget. Hoyt Curtin composed scores for dozens of Hanna-Barbera shows, developing a distinctive sound, jazzy and energetic, that defined the audio landscape of Saturday mornings. His themes for Johnny Quest, The Jetsons, Scooby-Doo became as recognizable as the characters themselves. The music created mood and atmosphere, signaled transitions, underscored action, and provided a kind of sonic continuity across different programs, so that Saturday morning had not just a visual identity, but an aural one as well. Johnny Quest premiered in 1964 and represented something of an anomaly, a show produced with higher animation quality than typical Saturday morning fare, featuring more realistic character designs, more elaborate action sequences, more serious storytelling that included genuine peril and consequences. The show followed a boy adventurer and his companions, his scientist father, his adoptive brother Haji, their bodyguard Race Bannon, and their dog Bandit, as they traveled the world encountering mysteries and dangers. The show's production values reflected its primetime origins. It had initially been designed for evening viewing, and when it moved to Saturday mornings after its first season, it stood out for its cinematic qualities, its willingness to embrace darkness and menace, its use of exotic locations and complex plots, but it also proved too expensive to sustain, demonstrating the economic limits of what Saturday morning budgets could support. And after a single season of new episodes, it went into reruns, becoming a beloved artifact that would be repeated throughout the decade. By the late 1960s, the Saturday morning landscape had become intensely competitive. All three major networks fought for young viewers, programming entire blocks from early morning through early afternoon, The shows multiplied and diversified. There were adventure shows and comedy shows, superhero shows and family shows, shows featuring talking animals, and shows featuring teenagers solving mysteries. The variety seemed endless, and yet certain patterns emerged. Certain formulas proved reliable. Certain types of stories and characters resonated more strongly than others. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Debuted on CBS in 1969 and became perhaps the most influential Saturday morning cartoon of its era. The show featured 4 teenagers and their Great Dane investigating supposedly supernatural mysteries that invariably turned out to have rational explanations. The formula was simple but endlessly repeatable. The gang would arrive at a location, encounter something mysterious or frightening, split up to investigate, fall into various predicaments, unmask the villain, and explain how the hoax was perpetrated. What made Scooby-Doo work was its perfect calibration to its audience. It offered scares that were never too scary, mysteries that were solvable, humor that came from character, interplay, and physical comedy. The show understood that children wanted to feel frightened in a controlled way, wanted to encounter danger from the safety of their living rooms, wanted to solve puzzles and feel clever. And the characters themselves, the brave leader Fred, the intelligent Velma, the pretty Daphne, the cowardly Shaggy, and the even more cowardly Scooby, provided models of friendship and cooperation, of working together to overcome challenges. The voice acting in these shows carried enormous weight. Actors like Don Messick, Mel Blanc, Dawes Butler, June Foray created dozens of distinct characters through vocal performance alone. Their skills allowed limited animation to work, because even when characters stood still or moved minimally, their voices brought them to life, gave them personality, made them memorable. Children recognized their favorite characters by sound as much as sight, could identify Bugs Bunny or Yogi Bear or Quick Draw McGraw within seconds of hearing them speak. Saturday morning viewing had become, by the end of the 1960s, a genuine cultural phenomenon, something that united children across geographic and social boundaries, in cities and suburbs and small towns. Children gathered before television screens each Saturday, experiencing the same shows, laughing at the same jokes, following the same stories. It created a shared language, a common reference point, and the experience was enhanced by the commercials that punctuated the programming, advertisements for sugary cereals and cheap toys that became part of the ritual that children anticipated almost as eagerly as the shows themselves. The cereals in particular became legendary. Brands like Quisp and Quake, Frankenberry and Count Chocula, King Vitaman and Cap'n Crunch, each with their own animated mascot, their own mythology, their own jingles and catchphrases. The boundary between programming and advertising blurred as cartoon characters sold products and products featured cartoon characters, creating a commercial ecosystem that critics would later condemn, but that children navigated with surprising sophistication, understanding the difference between stories and sales pitches, even as they enjoyed both. The toy commercials promised transformation, G.I. Joe figures that could be posed in infinite action scenarios, Hot Wheels cars that raced on bright orange tracks, easy bake ovens that allowed children to create real food with a light bulb. These advertisements sold not just products, but possibilities, suggesting that the right toy could unlock creativity, adventure, independence, and while the reality rarely matched the promise, the commercials themselves became part of the Saturday morning tapestry, memorable in their own right, quoted and referenced and remembered long after the products disappeared from stores. As the 1970s approached, Saturday morning cartoons had reached a kind of zenith. The format had been perfected, the audience had been captured, the economic model had been proven, but change was already stirring. New concerns about children's television were emerging, questions about violence and advertising, about educational value and nutritional responsibility. Forces that would reshape Saturday mornings in the decade to come, pushing the medium in new directions, creating new restrictions and new opportunities. But for now, in these final years of the 1960s, Saturday morning cartoons represented something pure, uncomplicated, a weekly escape into worlds of color and sound, where good triumphed and humor prevailed, where the next adventure was always just 7 days away. The 1970s opened with a shift in the cultural winds. Concerns that had been whispered in the late 1960s now found voice and volume. Parent groups and child psychologists, educators and lawmakers began questioning what children were watching during those unsupervised Saturday morning hours, what messages they were absorbing, what behaviors they might be learning from the endless parade of cartoon violence and commercial appeals. The controversy centered on two interrelated issues: the amount of violent content in children's programming and the nature of advertising directed at young viewers. Critics pointed to shows where conflicts were resolved through physical confrontation, where characters hit and kicked and chased each other with mallets and anvils, where the humor derived from pain inflicted and disasters narrowly avoided. They argued that such content normalized aggression, taught children that violence was an acceptable response to frustration, that problems could be solved through force. The advertising question cut even deeper. During Saturday morning broadcasts, commercials appeared approximately every few minutes, selling products designed to appeal to children who had no independent income, no ability to make purchasing decisions, yet who could influence their parents through persistent requests and pleas? The products themselves, heavily sugared cereals and cheaply made toys, raised questions about nutrition and value, about exploitation and responsibility. Action for Children's Television, an advocacy group founded in 1968 by Peggy Charon, became the most prominent voice calling for reform. The organization didn't seek to eliminate children's programming or ban commercials outright, but rather to raise standards, to reduce commercial time, to improve content quality, to ensure that television served children's developmental needs, rather than simply extracting profit from their attention. Their campaigns found sympathetic ears in government, and regulatory pressure began to mount on networks and advertisers alike. The networks responded with a mixture of resistance and accommodation. They created standards and practices departments, hired consultants to review content, developed guidelines about acceptable levels of cartoon violence. What emerged was a peculiar form of self-censorship, where action shows could continue but had to minimize certain types of consequences, where characters could be chased but not caught, could fall from cliffs but had to bounce back unharmed, could be hit with objects that left stars circling their heads but no lasting injury. The result was a kind of sanitization, a draining away of genuine stakes or peril. Superhero shows in the early 1970s featured heroes who rarely threw punches, who instead used their powers to build things or solve problems, who talked villains into surrendering rather than fighting them into submission. Super Friends debuted in 1973, featuring DC Comics heroes like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman working together as a team, but the show's conflicts were notably bloodless, its villains more misguided than malevolent, its resolutions invariably peaceful. Simultaneously, networks began incorporating educational content into Saturday morning lineups. Schoolhouse Rock premiered in 1973 on ABC, presenting short animated segments between regular programming that taught grammar, mathematics, history, and civics through catchy songs and clever visuals. Conjunction, Junction, I'm Just a Bill, 3 is a magic number, became embedded in the consciousness of a generation, teaching lessons that would outlast most of the cartoons that surrounded them. The educational mandate extended to full-length programs as well. Shows like The Jackson 5 combined entertainment with positive messages about cooperation and understanding. Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, which debuted in 1972, featured stories that addressed real issues facing urban youth, peer pressure and poverty, family dynamics and self-esteem. Each episode concluded with Bill Cosby appearing live to reinforce the moral lesson, to connect the animated story to real-world application. But even as networks attempted to balance commercial imperatives with social responsibility, the fundamental economics of Saturday morning television remained unchanged. The shows existed to deliver audiences to advertisers, to create environments where children would be receptive to commercial messages. And the tension between these dual purposes, entertainment and salesmanship, education and profit, would define Saturday morning programming throughout the decade. Hanna-Barbera continued to dominate production, but their output in the 1970s reflected the changing climate. Shows became gentler, more focused on mystery and adventure than action and conflict. Josie and the Pussycats featured an all-girl rock band solving mysteries while touring. The Funky Phantom paired teenagers with a Revolutionary War-era ghost. Speed Buggy gave personality to a sentient dune buggy and its teenage companions. These shows followed safe formulas, repeated successful patterns, offered comfort through familiarity. The studio also began producing shows based on existing live-action properties. The Brady Kids animated the characters from the popular sitcom The Brady Bunch, giving them adventures that would have been impossible or prohibitively expensive in live action. This trend of adapting existing properties would accelerate throughout the decade as networks sought to leverage brand recognition to attract audiences already familiar with characters from other media. New studios emerged to challenge Hanna-Barbera's dominance. Despatie-Freleng Enterprises, founded by former Warner Brothers animation veterans, produced The Pink Panther Show and later The Super Six and The Ant and the Aardvark. Their work retained some of the theatrical quality of classic Warner Brothers cartoons, a slightly sharper edge, a more sophisticated visual style, though still constrained by television budgets and schedules. Filmation continued producing action shows but adapted to the new climate. The New Adventures of Gilligan brought the castaways from Gilligan's Island into animation. Star Trek, the animated series, debuted in 1973. Continuing the adventures of the Enterprise crew with the original cast, providing voices, the show demonstrated that animation could tackle complex science fiction concepts, could appeal to older children and even adults, could be something more than simple entertainment for the very young. The mid-1970s saw an explosion of licensed properties, shows based on toys, comic books, movies, live-action television series. The Muppet Babies imagined Jim Henson's characters as children. Rubik the Amazing Cube built a series around a puzzle toy. Pac-Man transformed a video game into a family adventure. The line between content and commercial became increasingly blurred as entire shows functioned essentially as extended advertisements for product lines. Yet within this commercialization, moments of genuine creativity persisted. Schoolhouse Rock proved that educational content could be entertaining. Super Friends, despite its limitations, brought DC's pantheon to Saturday mornings, introducing characters like the Wonder Twins and Apache Chief, creating mythology that would influence how a generation understood superhero storytelling and individual episodes of various shows. Particularly those written by talented freelancers managed to transcend their commercial constraints, to tell stories that resonated, that stayed with viewers long after the toys had been discarded and the serials discontinued. The late 1970s brought another significant shift. The rise of cable television, stations like Nickelodeon, which launched in 1979, promised commercial-free children's programming, though this promise would not last. They offered alternatives to network Saturday morning blocks, different philosophies about what children's television could be. And while their initial reach was limited, their very existence signaled that the network's monopoly on children's attention was beginning to fracture. Home's video technology, still in its infancy, hinted at future disruptions. The ability to record programs, to watch them at times other than their scheduled broadcast, threatened the very premise of appointment viewing, of children gathering at specific times to watch specific shows, though these technologies would not reach critical mass until the following decade. Their potential was already visible, already beginning to influence how content was created and distributed. The 1980s arrived with Saturday morning cartoons facing an uncertain future. The format that had seemed eternal just a decade earlier now appeared vulnerable, subject to regulatory pressure, technological disruption, changing viewing habits, and evolving expectations about what children's programming should accomplish. The shows that had defined the 1970s, the gentle mysteries and educational segments, the licensed properties, and sanitized action, would give way to something different, to shows more directly tied to toy lines, to increased competition from cable networks, to a gradual erosion of the Saturday morning ritual itself. But before that erosion became complete, before cable and home video, and eventually streaming, would transform how children consumed entertainment, there came a final flowering, a last great era of Saturday morning dominance in the 1980s. Shows like The Smurfs, which debuted in 1981 and became NBC's anchor program, drawing massive audiences and running for 9 seasons. Muppet Babies, which premiered in 1984 and won multiple Emmy Awards. Garfield and Friends, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, programs that captured the zeitgeist, that became cultural phenomena, that demonstrated Saturday morning cartoons still possessed the power to unite and captivate young audiences. These shows of the 1980s differed from their predecessors. They were more likely to be based on existing properties, more tightly integrated with merchandising strategies, more conscious of their role in larger commercial ecosystems. But they also benefited from improved animation techniques, from writers who had grown up watching Saturday morning cartoons and understood their rhythms and possibilities, from voice actors who brought depth and nuance to their performances. The shows were products of their time, shaped by commercial forces and regulatory requirements, but also by genuine creative ambition. The landscape continued evolving through the decade. Fox launched as a fourth network in 1986 and immediately targeted Saturday mornings, bringing a more aggressive, less cautious approach to children's programming. Their shows like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles pushed back against the sanitization of the 1970s, reintroducing action and conflict, and finding enormous success in the process, proving that audiences had tired of overly gentle fare, that they craved stories with genuine stakes and excitement. Cable networks expanded their reach. Nickelodeon and the Disney Channel, Turner Broadcasting's Cartoon Network, each offered alternatives to network Saturday morning blocks, different philosophies, different content, and increasingly, children had choices, could find programming that suited their specific interests, rather than accepting whatever the three major networks decided to broadcast. The audience fragmented, divided among multiple channels and viewing options, and the communal experience of Saturday morning cartoons, of millions of children watching the same shows at the same time, began its long, slow fade. By the early 1990s, the Saturday morning landscape had fundamentally changed. Networks still broadcast children's programming during these hours, still attracted substantial audiences, but the sense of event, of ritual, of special time set apart had diminished. Children watched cartoons throughout the week on cable channels, recorded shows on VCRs to watch whenever convenient, rented animated movies from video stores. The scarcity that had made Saturday mornings precious no longer existed, and with abundance came a kind of diffusion, a loss of focus and intensity. The quality of animation had improved dramatically. Computer-assisted techniques allowed for more elaborate visuals, more consistent character designs, more ambitious action sequences. Shows like Batman, the animated series, which premiered in 1992, demonstrated that television animation could achieve theatrical quality, could tell sophisticated stories, could be taken seriously as an art form. But these shows often aired in afternoon or early evening slots, not Saturday mornings, which were increasingly seen as less prestigious, less important to network strategies, and so the era wound down, not with a dramatic ending, but with a gradual diminishment. Saturday morning cartoons continued through the 1990s and into the 2000s. Networks still filled the hours with animated programming, but the cultural centrality, the sense that these shows mattered, that they shaped childhood experience, slowly evaporated, replaced by a media landscape of infinite choice and constant availability, where cartoons could be watched anytime, anywhere, on televisions or computers, or eventually phones and tablets. The deepening comes when we consider what was truly happening during those Saturday morning hours, beneath the surface narratives of cartoon cats chasing cartoon mice, beneath the adventures of superheroes and the mysteries solved by meddling kids. Something more fundamental was occurring, a kind of collective dreaming. Millions of children sitting in darkened living rooms, their attention focused on glowing screens, their imaginations activated by simple drawings that moved and spoke. These cartoons were teaching more than they intended, not the explicit lessons of Fat Albert or Schoolhouse Rock, but subtler things. They taught narrative structure, how stories begin and develop and resolve. They taught character archetypes, the hero and the sidekick, the villain and the fool, the innocent and the trickster. They created a shared mythology, a common language of references and jokes and catchphrases that would bind generations together, allowing strangers to connect through mutual recognition of "What's up, Doc?" or "Zoinks," or "I would have gotten away with it too." The ritual itself carried meaning, the act of waking early on a day when sleep was permitted, of claiming the television before parents or siblings, of settling into a favorite spot with a bowl of cereal. This was a form of independence, a small sovereignty that children exercised over their Saturday mornings. They chose which channel to watch, when to change stations, whether to remain engaged or let attention drift. These were perhaps among the first autonomous decisions many children made, the first exercises of preference and will in a life otherwise directed by adults. And there was the texture of it, the specific feeling of those mornings, the quality of light filtering through curtains, the sound of cartoon voices mingling with the clink of spoon against bowl, the slight chill of a house not yet warmed by movement and activity, the sense of time suspended, stretched out, not yet claimed by obligations or expectations. These sensory details embedded themselves deeply, became part of how children understood Saturday itself, what it meant, what it felt like, how it differed from every other day. The commercials, despite their commercial intent, despite being designed explicitly to manipulate desire, also became part of the cultural education. They taught children about persuasion, about the difference between claim and reality, about wanting and having and the gap between the two. The toys never looked quite as good at home as they did on screen. The cereals never tasted quite as magical. And in learning this, in experiencing repeated small disappointments, children developed a kind of media literacy, a healthy skepticism about advertising that would serve them throughout life. The violence question, which so concerned critics and reformers, was perhaps more complex than either side acknowledged. Yes, cartoons featured characters hitting each other, falling from heights, being flattened and stretched and exploded, but children understood at some level that this was not real violence, not something to emulate. The physics were wrong, the consequences absent, the whole enterprise obviously fantastical, and perhaps there was value in this, in having a safe space to encounter aggression and conflict, to see it rendered harmless and silly, to laugh at it rather than fear it. The characters themselves, simple as they were, served as companions, as friends who appeared reliably every Saturday, who never changed, never aged, never disappointed. Scooby-Doo would always be cowardly but loyal. Bugs Bunny would always outsmart his adversaries. The Super Friends would always save the world. There was comfort in this constancy, in knowing that no matter what changed in a child's life, these characters would remain, would continue their eternal loops of conflict and resolution, pursuit and escape. And perhaps most importantly, Saturday morning cartoons created space for imagination to work. The limited animation, the simple plots, the two-dimensional worlds, left room for children to fill in details, to elaborate on what they saw, to extend the stories in their own minds beyond what appeared on screen. A child watching Johnny Quest might imagine themselves as part of the team, might dream up their own adventures, might create internal narratives that enriched and expanded the televised version, the music, those theme songs and incidental scores, operated on children's minds in ways that bypassed conscious thought. The melodies lodged themselves in memory, creating neural pathways that would remain accessible decades later. A few notes of the Spider-Man theme could transport someone instantly back to childhood, to a specific room, a specific feeling, a specific moment of pure absorption in story. This was the power of music combined with narrative, of sound welded to vision, of rhythm matching the rhythms of childhood itself. There was also something about the communal aspect. Even though children typically watched alone or with siblings, they were participating in something larger, millions of other children watching the same shows, laughing at the same jokes, following the same stories. And on Monday mornings at school, these shared experiences became social currency, ways to connect, to establish belonging, to find common ground with classmates and friends. Did you see? Became a ritual greeting, a way of confirming membership in the tribe of childhood. The closing comes gently, like the end of a Saturday morning itself, when cartoons gave way to sports programming or educational shows clearly designed for adults. When the spell broke and the regular world reasserted itself, when parents emerged from bedrooms and the house filled with activity and noise, when the magic hours ended and ordinary time resumed. Saturday morning cartoons as a cultural institution lasted roughly 4 decades in their fullest form, from the late 1950s through the late 1990s, a specific window in media history when technology and economics and cultural factors aligned to create something unique, something that had never existed before and would never exist again in quite the same way. The combination of broadcast scarcity and advertising economics, of children's early waking habits and parental desire for weekend sleep, of animation technology, affordable enough for television, but sophisticated enough to enchant. All these elements came together for a brief historical moment. The end, when it came, was gradual, a slow dissolution rather than a sharp break. Cable channels offered cartoons throughout the week. Home video allowed time shifting. The internet eventually provided on-demand access to more animated content than anyone could ever watch. The Saturday morning time slot lost its specialness, its unique hold on children's attention and imagination. Networks began filling the hours with other programming, educational shows to satisfy regulatory requirements, or simply infomercials when they could find nothing else profitable to broadcast. By the early 2000s, Saturday morning cartoons in their classic form had essentially vanished from network television. A few shows lingered, a few networks maintained abbreviated blocks, but the era had ended, the ritual had dissolved. Children still watched cartoons, perhaps more than ever. but they watched them on their own schedules, on their own devices, in their own rooms. The communal experience, the shared timing, the collective participation in a weekly ritual, all this had faded into memory. And yet, the memory persists. Adults who grew up during the golden age of Saturday morning cartoons carry those experiences with them, remember the shows and characters, can still sing the theme songs, still recall the feeling of those mornings, the specific quality of attention they brought to watching, the way time seemed to work differently, how the hours stretched out luxuriously, filled with color and sound and story. These memories have become part of cultural heritage, something passed down not through continued practice, but through nostalgia and recollection, through streaming services that offer vintage cartoons, through revival shows that attempt to recapture the magic, through parents sharing with children what Saturday mornings once meant, even though the experience itself can never be fully recreated, because it depended on context, on scarcity, on the specific technological and cultural conditions of its time. The legacy lives on in other ways, in the storytelling techniques absorbed by children who became writers and directors, in the character types and narrative structures that still appear in contemporary animation, in the understanding that cartoons can be more than mere distraction, that they can teach and inspire and create lasting bonds, that animation is a legitimate art form worthy of serious attention and creative ambition, and somewhere, in some part of memory, Saturday morning cartoons continue, existing outside time in a perpetual loop of reruns that never end, where Scooby and Shaggy are forever running from monsters, where Bugs is forever outwitting Elmer, where the Super Friends are forever assembling to save the world, where children are forever waking early, forever claiming the television, forever experiencing that particular magic that belonged to Saturday mornings and to Saturday mornings alone. The screen glows softly, even now, in memory, casting its gentle light across years and decades, illuminating something precious that once existed, a ritual of childhood, a weekly gathering around stories told in pictures and sound, a time when the world was simple enough to fit inside a television screen, and Saturday mornings lasted forever,